every hour of every day. The UK's expertise and resources have been central to the global response to this emergency, discovering both a vaccine and the first life-saving treatment for COVID. We've secured agreement from our friends in the G7 to provide 1 billion vaccines to protect the world by the end of next year, of which 100 million will come from the UK. We are the third biggest sovereign donor to the World Health Organization and the top donor to Gavi, which vaccinates children against killer diseases. We're devoting £11.6 billion, £11.6 billion, double our previous commitment, to help developing countries to deal with climate change, including by protecting their forests and introducing clean energy. And I can tell the House that this vital investment will be protected. And when it comes to addressing one of the world's gravest injustices, the tragedy that millions of girls are denied the chance to go to school, the UK has pledged more than any other country £430 million to the Global Partnership for Education, in addition to the £400 million we will spend on girls' education this year. Later this month, I will co-host a summit of this partnership in London with the President of Kenya, with President Kenyatta of Kenya. And wherever civil wars are displacing millions or threatening to inflict famine, in Syria, in Yemen, Ethiopia or elsewhere, the UK is responding with over £900 million of help this year, making our country the third largest bilateral humanitarian donor in the world. And it bears repeating that we are doing this in the midst of a terrible crisis, when our public finances are under greater strain than ever before in peacetime history. And every pound we spend in aid has to be borrowed, and in fact represents not our money, but money that we are taking from future generations. Last year we dissolved the old divide between aid and diplomacy that once ran through the entire Whitehall machine by creating the new Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office. And in doing so, my objective was to ensure that every diplomat in our service was actuated by the mission and vision of our finest development officials, and that our aid was better in tune with our national values and our desire to be a force for good in the world. So I can assure any honourable member who wishes to make the case for aid that they are, when it comes to me or to anyone in the government, preaching to the converted. And we shall act on that conviction by returning to 0.7% as soon as two vital tests have been satisfied. First, that the UK is no longer borrowing to cover current or day-to-day expenditure, and second, that public debt, excluding the Bank of England, is falling as a share of GDP. The moment that the forecast, I'm just coming to the end, the moment that the forecasts for the Office of Budget Responsibility show that both of those conditions will sustainably be met, then from the point at which they are met, we will willingly restore our aid budget to 0.7%. Plenty of people, Mr. Speaker, are wanting to speak in this debate. The government will, of course, review the situation every year and place a statement before this House in accordance with the International Development Act. But as we conduct that annual review, we will fervently wish to find that our conditions have been satisfied. This is one debate where the government and honourable members across the House share the same objective and the same, I'm sure the honourable lady will have plenty of time later on, and the same fundamental convictions. We all believe in the principle that aid can transform lives. And by voting for this motion, honourable members will provide certainty for our aid budget and an affordable path back to 0.7%, while also allowing for investment in other priorities, including the NHS, schools and the police. As soon as circumstances allow and the tests are met, we will return to the target that unites us, Mr. Speaker, and I beg to move this motion.
The question is, this House has now considered the Treasury update on international aid I now call the Leader of the Opposition, Keir Starmer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I start by thanking you and honourable members across the House for ensuring that this debate took place today, in particular the Right Honourable Member for Sutton Coldfield and the Right Honourable Member for Maidenhead. I think they're the lefty propagandists that the Prime Minister was talking about a couple of weeks ago, and I have to say that if the Prime Minister had confidence in the arguments he's making to this House, I rather think he would have given way to them a moment ago so these arguments can be tested. He doesn't have confidence in them, otherwise he would have done so. That is obvious already. But we do welcome the chance to debate this motion. The motion is broad, and if I may say so from this Prime Minister, typically slippery. The House should have had the opportunity for a straight up-down vote on whether to approve or reject the government's cut to overseas aid to 0.5%. This motion does not do that. But the Chancellor's written ministerial statement is clear. If the motion is carried, then the cut in overseas aid to 0.5% will effectively carry on indefinitely. And I'll expand on that point in just a moment. It's already been... Well, I'll expand on that point, and I will take interventions on it. But if the motion... in just 1 minute. I'm going to develop that argument. I'm going to develop that argument. When I get to it, I will give way so that argument can be tested in the usual way. But if the motion is rejected, and I quote, the government will consequently return to spending of 0.7% of GNI on international aid in the next calendar year. So let me be clear, Labour will vote to reject this motion tonight and to return overseas aid to 0.7% of GNI. I'm going to summarise my argument. I'm going to make my argument. When I get to the relevant part, I will take interventions. The case that we make is this. First, that the cut is wrong because investing in 0.7% in international aid is in Britain's national interest. Second, because the economic criteria set out by the Chancellor would lead to an indefinite cut, likely to last beyond this Parliament. And thirdly, because it matters that this House keeps its word to the voters who elected us. Mr. Speaker, every member here was elected on a manifesto to retain the 0.7% target. And it matters that we keep our promises to the world's poorest, particularly at such a time of global uncertainty. I will give way.
Grateful to the right honourable gentleman. I agree with him about keeping promises, and we on this side were also elected to keep fiscal promises, to reduce our debt and not to borrow for day-to-day spending. I hope in his remarks he will set out, given that he's not going to support this motion, which areas of spending he's going to cut to pay for it, or which taxes he's going to raise. If he doesn't do either of those things, then I'm afraid his promises and his vote today are hollow and no one will believe them.
Well, I have to say it's a bit rich for someone who may break the manifesto commitment to say that the vote today and the words today are hollow. But just to take that straight on, it is a false economy, I'm afraid. Cutting aid will increase costs and have a big impact on our economy. Development aid reduces, we all know this, it reduces conflict, it reduces disease and people fleeing from their homes. It is a false economy to pretend that this is some sort of cut that doesn't have consequences. I will give way.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. The right honourable gentleman is making a House of Commons speech, not a partisan speech. But can I ask him what I would have asked the Prime Minister if the Prime Minister had given way? First of all, will he confirm that the cut we are discussing today is 1% of the borrowing the Prime Minister described, which he quite rightly sanctioned last year? Secondly, will he underline the fact that this was an all-party promise that was made at the general election by every single one of us, and we really should not break our promises to the poorest in this terrible way?
Yes and yes. It was not ambivalent in the manifestos, and it wasn't conditional. It was clear. Mr. Speaker, on the first part of the argument, the national interest, British aid saves lives. It builds a more secure world and it promotes democracy and British soft power. For the last 20 years, that has been the political consensus across this House. Tony Blair and Gordon Brown first set the goal of the UK reaching the 0.7% target. I'm making a speech to the House and for the House. David Cameron and the Right Honourable Member for Maidenhead made it a reality. And we acknowledge that in the right way. It has been supported, all the chunterings, all very well. This has been a cross-party position for 20 years. Successive prime ministers have kept to the commitment. Every living prime minister thinks this is wrong. There's only one prime minister who's prepared to do this, and he's sitting there. I acknowledge what those opposite, the prime ministers sitting opposite the opposite party, did in relation to this. I'm openly acknowledging that it's been supported by all parties, and rightly so. As the 6th richest country in the world, Britain has a moral obligation to help the world's poorest. And our aid budget has done that with fantastic results. Providing education for women and girls, fighting poverty, providing sanitation, healthcare and vaccines, building resilience and infrastructure, an incredible post-conflict and reconstruction work where Britain does, I think, a better job than anyone else. So it has real results. And let's be clear what these cuts would mean. 1 million girls losing out on schooling. Nearly 3 million women and children going without life-saving nutrition. 5.6 million children left unvaccinated. An estimated 100,000 deaths worldwide. Mr. Speaker, he says rubbish. That is the human toll of the choices this government is making, and it's not rubbish. I will give way.
The case of the right honourable gentleman is the Prime Minister is making a promise he will not keep. But what did Tony Blair and Gordon Brown do? They made a promise, but they never ever spent 0.7% of GDP on aid, and therefore the right honourable gentleman's speech lacks all moral force.
They more than doubled it. They set the goal, and then successive prime ministers implemented that goal. That is such a weak argument. 11 years into this government, that is such a weak argument. I've always found this argument particularly weak, Mr. Speaker. When I was Director of Public Prosecutions, which was a 5-year term, the very idea that I could turn round 4 or 5 years into the role and say it was somebody else's fault 5, 10, 15, 20 years ago. This is such a bad argument that's used all of the time. They've been in power for 11 years. Either take responsibility for what you're doing or give up. Our overseas aid budget goes beyond that moral obligation. It also helps to build a more stable world and keeps us safer in the UK. Let's take Afghanistan, where aid has supported improvements in security, in governance, in economic development, in rights for women and girls. Yet despite all the challenges that that country now faces, and the security and terrorist threats that that poses to the UK, and we know about those, and the previous Prime Minister knows about those, UK aid to Afghanistan is being cut from 192.3 million to 38.2 million. That's Afghanistan. Prime Minister Chunter's there, actually the government figures. In Yemen, the biggest humanitarian crisis in the world, the UK aid has been cut by nearly 60%. In Syria, the government is slashing aid by around 50%. And for the Rohingya refugees in Bangladesh, there's a cut of 42%. All of those decisions will create more refugees, more instability, and more people having to flee their homes. I will give way.
I'm grateful to my right honourable friend for giving way. Is he aware of the words that General James Mattis, the former Defence Secretary of the United States, gave to the former President Trump when he, President Trump, proposed cutting overseas aid? General Mattis says, fine, cut it, but you'll have to give me, the Defence Secretary, more money to buy more bullets.
I am aware of it, and that exposes the false economy argument in the Prime Minister's case. This cut will also reduce UK influence, Mr. Speaker, just when it's needed most. And of course it risks leaving a vacuum which other countries, for example China and Russia, will fill. And at a time when Britain is hosting COP26 and, of course, hosted G7, we should be using every means at our disposal to create a fairer and safer world. But we are the only G7 country which is cutting our aid budget. The only G7 country. Mr. Speaker, that is not the vision of global Britain we want to see on these benches, and I don't think it's the vision of global Britain that many on the opposite benches want to see either. I will give way.
I'm grateful to the Leader of the Opposition, and all of us in this House long to see our aid commitments re-established at 0.7% of national income. But nevertheless, he will appreciate that we continue to be one of the most generous donors to foreign aid. And can he explain, he's making a good point about 0.7%, can he explain why in all of the Labour years of government they averaged 0.36% of national income on overseas aid?
Well, they doubled it, actually. Let me turn to my second point, which has already been debated. The economic argument behind the government's position. The economic argument behind the government's position, Chancellor. The Prime Minister and Chancellor say that these cuts are unavoidable because of the pandemic and the economic consequences that we now find ourselves in. But, Mr. Speaker, the whole point of the 0.7% target is that it is relative to the UK's economic success or challenges. It rises when we grow, it falls when we experience economic shock like the pandemic. Nobody in this House is arguing for overseas aid to be maintained at the pre-pandemic levels during the downturn in strict terms. We all recognise that a contracting economy means a relative contraction in our aid budget. But what the Chancellor and Prime Minister are asking the House to agree goes beyond that, to impose a new target of 0.5% and to create entirely new criteria for ever returning to 0.7. And in effect, Mr. Speaker, the Chancellor is today proposing a double lock against reverting to 0.7%. The written ministerial statement makes clear that Britain will only go back to 0.7% when public debt is falling as a percentage of GDP and there is a current budget surplus. Let me make this point, and the Prime Minister can intervene if he wants. On the former point, the OBR does not predict public debt falling as a percentage of GDP until 2024 or 25 at the earliest. Prime Minister, if you want to intervene, I'm ready. So that would mean it won't happen in any year in this Parliament. I'm clear about that. Anybody want to intervene? That's the OBR recommendation.
I thank the Leader of the Opposition for allowing me to intervene on this. Perhaps he could help me in ascertaining when those targets would have been met in the last 20 years.
Well, it's a very good point that I'm going to come on to, because certainly I think it's once in the 20 years. But there are 2 points here, and if the contrary argument, the Prime Minister can make it. But the OBR on point 1 does not predict a fall of debt as a percentage of GDP until 2024 to 2025. So anybody voting tonight, pretending to themselves that this is temporary and it's going to be changed in a year or two, is not looking at the facts. And if anybody wants to intervene and say the OBR's got it completely wrong, they've got better statistics, please do so, including yourself, Prime Minister. On the second point, the OBR does not forecast a current surplus for the entire forecast period, their entire forecast period. In fact, there's no expected timeline for that criterion to be met at all. So what the Chancellor is setting out today isn't a temporary cut in overseas aid, it's an indefinite cut. And on the very point, let me remind the House that there have only been, I think, 5 times in the last 30 years that a current budget surplus has been run. 4 of them, I might add, under a Labour government and 1 under the Conservatives. So the chances of these criteria being met under a Conservative Chancellor are remote at best. And the more so because this statement creates an artificial £4.3 billion fiscal penalty for any Chancellor who seeks to rebalance the budget. So this is an indefinite cut. It is not going to reverse next year or the year after, and there's no contrary argument, however much the Prime Minister shakes his head. Mr. Speaker, this is not just about economic necessity, it is a political choice that is being made. And it's a choice that is not only against our national interest, it further erodes trust in our politics. And that brings me to my third point, which is trust. And there's a central divide now in British politics and across the world between those who value truth, integrity and honesty and those who bask in breaking them. We were all elected on manifestos that commit to the 0.7% target. I'm proud to have stood on that commitment, and I know many honourable members across this House are as well. I will in just a moment. But let me quote the Conservative manifesto. We will proudly maintain our commitment to spend 0.7% of GNI on development. Page 53, Prime Minister. Don't shake your head. It's there in black and white. As members opposite have said, that is not equivocal, it's not conditional, it was a clear promise to the voters. It should be honoured. And if it's not, Mr. Speaker, where does that leave us? There are already countless examples of the Prime Minister breaking his promises. No hard border in the Irish Sea, no cuts to armed forces, an already prepared plan for social care. The list is endless. And this matters. It matters to the British people that they can trust a Prime Minister to honour a clear commitment. That matters. It matters to our reputation around the globe that the word of the British government will hold in good times and bad. And today, Mr. Speaker, the House has the chance to stand up for a better kind of politics, for the national interest, to do what we know is right and to honour our commitments to the world's poorest. When this division is called this evening, Labour MPs will do so, others opposite I'm sure will do so, and I'd urge all members to do so. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Can I just remind all members there is a 3-minute limit? Theresa May.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to you and the Government for enabling us to have this debate today. I stood on a manifesto to maintain international aid funding at 0.7% of GNI. Not just that, we said we will proudly maintain our commitment to spend 0.7% of GNI on development. Now, early last year, the pandemic hit. It had an immediate negative effect on the economy. Yet in September 2020, when that effect on the economy had been seen, when public spending was increasing, when the government was already borrowing hundreds of billions of pounds, the government confirmed, in its response to the 4th report of the International Development Select Committee, that it would honour that manifesto commitment, saying a commitment enshrined in law and one to which the new department, the FCDO, will honour its responsibilities. It went on to say that investing that 0.7% was at the heart of the vision of the government's integrated review for the UK as an active internationalist, problem-solving and burden-sharing nation. Where is that vision now, as the government turns its back on some of the poorest in the world? With GNI falling, our funding for aid was falling in any case. To reduce it from 0.7 to 0.5% is a double blow. This isn't about palaces for dictators and vanity projects. It's about what cuts to funding mean, that fewer girls will be educated, more girls and boys will become slaves, more children will go hungry, and more of the poorest people in the world will die. Now, the government has promised what they see as a compromise, and I'm grateful to the Chancellor for speaking to me last night. I asked how long it would take before the tests are met and we return to 0.7%. I was told 4 to 5 years, but it could be sooner because the economy is recovering so well. Now, if the motion is defeated tonight, it will be 0.7% from January next year. The government appears to be saying to us, we can't afford 0.7% next year because the economy is doing so badly, but actually the economy is doing so well that we could very well be able to restore 0.7% very soon. But the government can't have it both ways. And I certainly doubt whether the tests will ever be met in 5 years' time. Meeting them depends not only on a significant recovery in the economy, and the OBR is forecasting trend growth of less than 2%, but also on the government reining in its inclination to continue to increase public spending. We're told there'll be dire consequences for tax and public spending if this motion is defeated tonight. We've borrowed £400 billion. Where are the dire warnings about that? It seems that £4 billion is really bad news. 400 billion, who cares? Now, finally, as has been pointed out, the 2 tests have only been met in 1 calendar year in the last 20. I have been in this House for nearly a quarter of a century. During that time, I have never voted against a 3-line whip from my party. As Prime Minister, I suffered at the hands of rebels. I know what it is like to see party colleagues voting against their government. We made a promise to the poorest people in the world. The government has broken that promise. This motion means that promise may be broken for years to come. With deep regret, I will vote against the motion today.
I now come to SNP spokesperson Chris Law.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, there's not a single nation on our planet that has escaped the devastation of this global pandemic, and there's not a single person that's pretending that the challenge of recovery from COVID is easy. We also know that it's been the poorest in our own society that have been hit the hardest over the past 18 months, and tragically this has been replicated across the globe. Inequality has widened, millions have been pushed into poverty, development gains have been reversed, and it is the poorest and most vulnerable in our societies that are dying. Therefore, Mr. Speaker, we need a global recovery that builds forward better, creates a fairer, more inclusive and more sustainable world, and ultimately honours the millions who've lost or are losing their lives to this terrible pandemic. In order to do this, the wealthiest countries in the world, of which the UK is one, must step up to tackle the great challenges facing humanity, not step away. However, it is with the deepest regret this UK government's callous cut to the aid budget is not only jeopardising these efforts, it will also mean that the poorest and most vulnerable people in the world will pay the ultimate price. Mr. Speaker, make no mistake, these cuts will cost lives. The UK government is making a desperate effort to stress the economic necessity of cutting aid from 0.7 to 0.5% of GNI. They are desperate to talk about fiscal tests, borrowing levels and tax receipts, but they do not want to address the questions that put them to shame. How many children will go without an education? How many girls will be forced into unwanted marriages and teenage pregnancies? Ultimately, how many individuals will die needlessly because of this government's decision? These are questions the government's been running away from, just as they've been running away from this debate and this vote for the past 6 months. It should simply never have come to this. This Parliament should have had a vote on the aid cut before it was implemented, but instead they pressed ahead with international austerity on the backs of the world's most poorest and vulnerable people. Without consultation with those most in need, without any impact assessment and without any debate in this Parliament, this government made their decision based on a Treasury spreadsheet and with a stroke of a pen signed a death sentence on a policy that will lead to 1 million excess children's deaths.
Shade.
So for those who are considering voting in favour of this motion here today, reflect on this. Are you building forward and leaving no one behind in a global strategy against COVID? Are you honouring the millions who are losing their lives and many more millions who will lose their livelihoods as well as a result of this pandemic? Are you happy to sign that death sentence? So, Mr. Speaker, let's look at a few examples of the life-saving aid programmes that are being curtailed or cancelled with horrifying consequences right now. Yemen is the world's worst humanitarian disaster, with 20 million people suffering from hunger and malnutrition, and many of them are facing famine after years of war. Despite this, the UK government has slashed its humanitarian funding to the country by over 60%. The UN Secretary-General put it bluntly when he said, and I quote, "Millions of Yemeni children, women and men desperately need aid to live. Cutting aid is a death sentence. Given that 400,000 children under 5 might starve to death in Yemen alone this year, how on earth can this government defend itself?" I'm happy to give way.
I'm grateful to the honourable gentleman, and he makes a very good point about Yemen, although it should be acknowledged that the amount of aid that the UK gave to Yemen was well in excess of what we budgeted for, and we've had a very generous record. But does he not agree that it's not only a question of emergency aid? If we are to find peace in that country, we will need to give aid for the reconstruction of that country to keep it out of civil war and famine again in the future. So it is entirely the wrong time not to be able to step up with that necessary money for a lasting peace.
I thank the Honourable Member for his comments, and I agree with every point he makes. It's in our national security and in our national interest to be stepping up, not stepping away at this point. Secondly, the UK government's funding to the UN's Population Fund, which provides contraceptives and reproductive health supplies globally, has been cut by a staggering 85%. Yes, you heard that correctly, 85%. The UN stated that these cuts will be devastating for women and girls and their families across the world. The money that's been withheld by this government would have helped prevent 250,000 child and maternal deaths, preventing nearly 15 million unintended pregnancies, and prevent over 4 million unsafe abortions. And just to show how ridiculous these cuts are, Mr. Speaker, tens of thousands of people are likely to die needlessly due to the fact that nearly 300 million doses of medicine for the treatment of neglected diseases in Africa are at risk of expiring because the Foreign Office has announced it's withdrawing almost entirely its allocated funding. So far, the UK Government has not confirmed that expiring medicines will be distributed urgently rather than destroyed. What an utter folly, an absence of simple human decency. So for those voting in this motion today, tell this to your constituents, because these are the simple facts. Mr. Speaker, there are just 3 examples that cover women's reproductive rights, disease prevention and urgent humanitarian assistance. These cuts are happening across the board with programmes to eradicate poverty, prevent conflict and even combating climate change in the year that we're hosting COP26 here in Glasgow, all suffering a similar fate. Each budget reduced, each project scaled back, each programme cancelled results in a loss of hard-fought progress, a loss of expertise and fundamentally, Mr. Speaker, a loss of trust. This so-called temporary measure will inflict long-term damage and long-term pain and suffering, which is why this cut must be urgently reversed. Mr. Speaker, the government is pretending that there's no other option than to cut from 0.7 to 0.5, but we know this not to be the case. In fact, it's blatantly not the case. It must have been a complete humiliation for the UK government when they were hosting the G7 summit in Cornwall last month, when it should have been a moment of pride in demonstrating our shared collective values. And this House may ask why. It is because every other G7 country has recognised the necessity of helping those in urgent need at this time of unprecedented volatility, as has increased their aid spending. Sadly, because of these brutal... yes, happy to give it.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'm grateful for the honourable member giving way. But would he also acknowledge that they may have raised it from a much lower level, and we shall still be the 3rd highest in the G7?
Indeed.
I thank the honourable member for his comments. This isn't a question of pride that we're still giving very generously and we'll be the 3rd most. We're also the 6th wealthiest nation. And given the fact we keep talking about a global Britain, we're actually shrinking Britain with these cuts. We're actually losing our soft power. You're going against national security. You're going against our collective national interest right across this House and with every party who is here today. Sadly, because of these brutal cuts by the UK government, the massive increase in spending, to come back to your point, from Germany was effectively cancelled out by the UK's reduction. And within these islands, I should also add, the Scottish Government has increased its international aid budget by 50%. This puts this House, frankly, at shame with this motion. It is simply a matter of political priorities, and his Chancellor and his Prime Minister have shown what their priorities lie. Let's not kid ourselves to think this has been spent on health, welfare and education at home, because it clearly isn't. The Chancellor chose to take money away from preventing famine and malnutrition, on conflict prevention and on protecting our planet and marginalised communities from the devastating effects of climate change. Instead, and I'm glad to see the Chancellor in his position today, he chose to spend the money on enhanced cyber weapons, AI-enabled drones, and the biggest folly of all, increased stockpiles of nuclear weapons, weapons of mass destruction, after he delivered a windfall for the defence budget, the very same month that the cut from 0.7 to 0.5% was announced. And if this is not an act of national shame, let's look at the icing on the cake. The Prime Minister, who's no longer in his seat, and he should be embarrassed when I read this, believes that spending upwards of £200 million on a shiny, brand new Royal Yacht Britannia 2.0 is more important than using life-saving aid to deliver a more just, peaceful and secure world. This is despite the fact the royal family's complete displeasure. And Mr. Speaker, how un-British could this be? Even every former living...
Order. Normally, we don't bring in the royal family into discussions or debates. They're outside of our debates. I know, but these are the rules of the House. Chris Law.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I only raise it because it's on the record elsewhere. Thank you. Even every former living Prime Minister has opposed this cut and continues to do so. Mr Speaker, the simple fact is aid spending has always been in the Prime Minister's sights ever since he described it, and I quote, spending huge sums of British taxpayers' money as though we were some independent Scandinavian NGO and shoving money out the door. He's now chosen to go against a decades-long cross-party consensus, breaking his own manifesto promise, and that of all his Conservative colleagues, as he's dragged far right by UKIP and the Brexit Party, and implementing their promises to cut aid instead. Mr Speaker, this will likely herald a new decade of austerity. Let's call it austerity 2.0. We all know what the first decade was like. There is nothing temporary about this motion. This isn't global Britain. This is a nasty, short, poor and brutish, and most of all, a very little Britain. Across this House, we all stood on a manifesto commitment to protect the 0.7% spend on international development. That is, for those of you not very good at maths, 7 pence in every £10. When I describe this to children in primary schools I visit and young people in my constituency, they're surprised at how little we spend as the 6th wealthiest nation in the world. And they're right to be so. So today, we have an opportunity to reaffirm our values, rather than be led into voting to balance the imaginary books on the backs of the world's poorest. We must all keep to our word to deliver on our promises to our fellow global citizens, who are the most marginalised and vulnerable people on earth. If COVID has taught us anything, it is that we all share in the same struggles and challenges, but also hopes and dreams of a better future, working together as one planet and one community. Now more than ever before, we must step up to support our global community, not step away. There is no honour for those who have suffered as a result of this pandemic and stepping away. There is no meaning in the phrase building back better if we turn our backs. And for those who decide to vote for this immoral motion today, there is no place for you to hide. When asked the question, why did you vote for this by your own children, your own friends, your family, and equally importantly, your constituents, it will be an indelible mark against your opportunity to do the right thing here today, and you will have to live with it for the rest of your time in this House. Thank you, Mr Speaker.
Drew Mitchell. Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I draw the House's attention to my interests in the register. Mr Speaker, the government has done the right thing today in ensuring that this House has a vote on this matter, and thank you, Mr Speaker, for standing up for Parliament in that respect. And there is a straight choice, as outlined by the Leader of the House yesterday in his statement, and it is between rejecting this motion tonight, in which case the government will restore the 0.7 from next year. That was the olive branch that I and my right honourable and honourable friends suggested, or accept this so-called Treasury compromise. But I tell the House this is no compromise at all. It is a fiscal trap for the unwary. First of all, it is quite possible that these conditions will never be met. And you don't need, Mr Speaker, to look in the crystal ball. You can read the book. It is indisputably the case that there have only been one occasion in the last 2 decades, in 2001, when these conditions would have been met. And if you look at what the OBR has said, it is very clear that the debt to GDP will not be falling until 2024-5, and the day-to-day debt won't fall from 25 to 26. So given that the 0.7 goes up and down with our economic performance, a very important point that the 0.7 policy protects us in that respect. Yes, I'll give way.
Very grateful to him for giving way, but does he not accept that the OBR have exaggerated the gloom on the debt and deficit, particularly in the last 2 years? They exaggerated it by 50 billion for last year between November and March. So why on earth does he believe their gloomy figures now? I'm sure we're going to get the deficit down.
But my right honourable friend is looking in the crystal ball. I've read in the book, in the last 20 years, there would have been just one occasion. So a vote for the government tonight is a vote to end, in my submission, our 0.7 commitment.
To that point?
Yes.
I'm sorry to interrupt the right honourable gentleman, but does it say something when every single economic and political commentator has said that this new mechanism will not see the 0.7% returned in the way that it should, that it is a cop-out of the highest order?
My honourable friend is absolutely right. It is, as I said, a trap for the unwary and a tribute to the Chancellor of the Exchequer's silver tongue. So I shall certainly tonight, Mr. Speaker, be voting against this motion and against the government today. I shall do so with absolute conviction and a profound disappointment. This is only the third time, I think, since I was elected in 1987 that I have voted against the government, and one of those occasions was in the company in the lobby of the Prime Minister. It's never easy to rebel, and I thank those who stood with us to support our manifesto. We should not be breaking our promise in the way. We should certainly not be seeking to balance the books on the backs of the poorest people in the world. I'm incredibly proud to have been a member of a Conservative administration which declined to do that, even with the austerity that we faced. And for goodness sake, Mr. Speaker, this is 1% of the borrowing that the Chancellor quite rightly made last year to shore up our country from COVID. It's 1%. It's a tiny figure, and it is the only cut that he has announced. And it will have an enormous impact on our role in the world and, above all, on the huge number of people who will be very severely damaged, maimed, often blinded, and indeed die as a result of these cuts. I remind the House that the cuts include 25% on girls' education, a top priority of our Prime Minister and this administration. For neglected tropical diseases, where thank goodness the philanthropists have stepped in for 1 year only to protect the British taxpayers' investment, we've cut it by 90%. And in the Yemen, as my right honourable friend said earlier, by 60%, which is literally the equivalent of taking food away from starving people. And this is what we are doing to the world's poorest. This is how we are trashing our international reputation. We are the only country in the G7 cutting in the middle of a pandemic. Everyone else is increasing. And this is a decision we do not need to make. Since we started this campaign, Mr. Speaker, there's been a 9% increase in support across our country for the government's policies. And it is, to coin a phrase, worse than a crime, it is a mistake. And may I say, Mr. Speaker, finally, in humble respect to my own party, some of us have seen this movie before. It took us 23 years until 2015 to achieve an overall majority by wiping out the Liberals, Democrat seats. And to achieve it, we secured the support of decent internationalist pro-development spending who saw from our time in austerity that we would stand by this promise. The former Brexit Secretary and I visited Chesham and Amersham, and may I say that our much-loved former colleague, Cheryl Gillan, would be voting with us on this issue tonight. Anyone who thinks this is not affecting our party's reputation is living in cloud cuckoo land. In Chesham and Amersham, they have the biggest Christian aid group in the country. There is an unpleasant odour wafting out from under my party's front door. This is not who we are. This is not what global Britain is. And I urge my right honourable and honourable friends tonight to vote against this motion.
We now go to the Chair of the Select Committee, Sarah Champion. Sarah.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It doesn't show respect for the House to ask us to take such a significant decision with little notice, little explanation and no clarity about the consequences of today's vote. It doesn't show respect for communities in the poorest parts of the world when this government is willing to play games with their lives and livelihoods in this way. The government presents a motion as giving Parliament an opportunity to have a say on when and how the UK will return to spending 0.7 of GNI on aid. But today isn't really about the 0.7 target or the cuts or livelihoods that are already being affected by our reduced spending. It's about exerting pressure on government backbenchers who have been brave enough to call out what the government is doing. Basically, back this or you'll be blamed when taxes rise or spending falls. Things that will likely happen because of the pandemic anyway. Today is yet another example of this government's complete lack of regard for parliamentary scrutiny, and they have form. There is a pattern of this government withholding information until the last minute and then only making the most basic details available. Let's be clear, the government hasn't brought forward a substantive motion for this debate. The motion they have tabled is made in neutral terms, a device that was intended to allow the House to debate an issue without coming to a view. They claim this debate is binding. It is not our procedures that make it binding. It is their political choice. This is a knee-jerk reaction dreamt up between last Thursday and yesterday in the face of growing criticism of this government. Talks of returning to 0.7. Yesterday's WMS talks of returning to 0.7 only when we are not borrowing for day-to-day spending and underlying debt is falling. Or on their own, each of these tests is a high hurdle. When combined, these conditions become incredibly strict. Since the 0.7 target was introduced in 2013, these tests have been met only once. They explicitly link ODA spending to policy decisions made by other government departments on tax and spending. This double lock could lead to an indefinite cut in aid spending. And of course, the tests do nothing to prevent them dropping lower than the 0.5%. The OBR has said the UK's economy is forecast to return to pre-pandemic levels in the second quarter of 2020, faster than originally thought. So if a return to economic normality is getting closer, then why the need to introduce these extra tests before returning to 0.7? They just added roadblocks, artfully placed by the Treasury, on the track back to the legally mandated level of 0.7. Fundamentally, this statement paints aid spending as an either-or choice. We're either spending on domestic public services or on international aid. It's an artificial choice MPs are being forced to make. This is a breathtakingly cynical manoeuvre, and the House must not fall for it.
David Davis. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I mean, I consider myself an economic Thatcherite, and yet when I come to choose between money and lives, I always choose lives. So this House should remember that what should be at the forefront of every member's mind today is this is a vote where we are choosing whether or not to intervene to save lives. That's the key issue, not the monetary issue, which I'll come back to in a second. The government argues that this is a policy the United Kingdom can't afford. But we should remember, I mean, we've heard about this being a small fraction of borrowing. There's even an even smaller fraction of our spending. We spend in a non-COVID year at least £800 billion. So the £3.5 billion of saving we're talking about is less than 0.5% of that. That is what the Treasury tells us is the critical, overwhelming measure that forces us to do something which has such dramatic consequences as we are talking of today. And if the Chancellor says, as his press spokesman did in the course of last week, well, you find the money from somewhere else, asking that question of a past Public Accounts Committee chairman is very dangerous for a Chancellor, out of 800 million. But as my honourable friend said, we were in Cheshire and Amersham a week or two ago, and Cheryl Gillan would have said to the Chancellor, well, why don't you just cancel HS2? That's between 100 and 200 billion pounds. It would pay for 25 to 50 years of this shortfall. It's really that simple. So I don't really accept that what the Chancellor is saying, that this is the only place, indeed the best place for savings to be found, is cutting aid, which will cost lives. Such a choice is morally reprehensible. Let's be clear about it. Morally reprehensible. I'll give way to my friend.
My right honourable friend is making an incredibly good point, but has he also noticed that in the Chancellor's outstanding policy on spending announced last November, the cut he's referring to, this cut of 1% of the borrowing on COVID last year, is the only cut that has been announced, the only one?
Yeah, well, my right honourable friend is right. I mean, that makes the priority of this cut even more morally representative. But indeed, as I think the spokesman of the SNP said, at the same time, we're actually increasing spending on defence. Now, I happen to agree with increasing spending on defence, but I don't agree with cutting spending on things that will lead to need for more defence, namely migration, civil wars, and the rest of it. Now, as has been pointed out by my right honourable friend, by the honourable lady who's just spoke from Rotherham, by the Leader of the Opposition, the government's proposed double lock on returning to 0.7% is deceptive. It's designed to look reasonable, but in fact, none of the people who have spoken so far actually stated the full case. Because although it's only been met once since 1990 under a Conservative government, and never been met really once just about under the government since the policy 0.7% policy was put in place, in fact it's never been met. It's actually never been met since 1970, because what the wording says is not a current budget surplus, but a sustainable current budget surplus. And all the current budget surplus we've been talking about so far have been 1 year. And frankly, the one under us in 2018 was 1 year for about 10 nanoseconds. It was a very, very tiny surplus. In practice, since the 1970s, we've not had a sustainable current surplus. So I'm afraid, under the actual wording in the statement, we're not looking at this for a very long time indeed. We've heard the leader of the opposition said years, possibly decades, possibly never. And I think he's right about that. Now, the proposal won't do anything, even if it were to be met, even if the condition was met, to deal with the crises that are caused by the policy already, right now. The government argues the cuts are temporary, but death is never temporary. And cause deaths.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Speaker. Since ministers announced that the UK was going to be the only G7 country to cut its aid this year, despite all of those other countries facing the same fiscal pressures, there's not one member of this House who is not now aware of the consequences of the decision that ministers have taken. A cut of 85% in the support that we give to the United Nations Population Fund to prevent maternal child death and unwanted pregnancy. A cut of 95% to the Global Polio Eradication Initiative at the very moment when the world is closer than it has ever been to eradicating this dreadful disease. And a cut of 50% in the support we give to the Mine Humanitarian Action Programme, which stops people losing their arms, their legs and their lives to unexploded ordnance. It's a very long list. And every one of those things harms our reputation and doesn't help us to persuade others, because other countries judge us not by what we say, but by what we do. And therefore the choice before the House today is a very stark one. Do we act to put this right, or do we accept the double lock that has been proposed? And I urge the House to reject it, because there's a principle here. What is it about the level of government spending on helping the world's poorest people that it alone is going to be subject to these tests? No other area of government expenditure, just this one. If this is about protecting the public finances, then why is this area of government expenditure, which is the money we spend on getting children into school or vaccinating children so they don't die of diseases that our children do not die of, why is it being singled out? Now, I have great admiration for the OBR, but determining the level of our international aid spending is not part of its responsibility. It is the government's responsibility. It is a political responsibility, and ministers should not try and pass the buck on to someone else, especially when, if you read the latest OBR forecast, it is exceedingly unlikely that the two tests will be met in the next 5 years. I will give way, of course.
Can I just pick him up on that point about other areas of expenditure? It seems to me that the Treasury and the Chancellor, having set out these tests, which are in our manifesto, and we mean to keep them, is the comprehensive spending review that's taking place this year. It seems to me we will be judging all other areas of government expenditure by these measures, and I see the Chancellor nodding. So it seems to me that we're being very consistent here, and I think it's important that we keep these promises about our fiscal responsibilities, as well as getting back on track to meeting our aid responsibilities.
Well, I'm afraid, I say to the Right Honourable Gentleman, I take a different view of the government's consistency, because it has chosen quite specifically and knowingly and deliberately to break a cast iron promise that was also contained in that manifesto to the world's poorest people. And as I said in my last contribution on this subject, most of them probably got no idea that this House had made that commitment together, but the government has chosen to do that. And the choice we're making today is, do we think that's right, or do we think that is wrong? And I would say to the Chancellor, if he thinks the double lock is a way out of the political problem, I don't think it isn't, because the issue that is before us hasn't gone away. It's just the same as it was the day the original cut was announced. And the question is this: is it right morally, practically, politically, to break our word to the world's poorest people? That's the question that is before us. Well, I would argue that it isn't. It's wrong in principle, it is harmful in practice, as we've heard from the excellent speeches on the benches opposite. It is not, I think, who we are. It is not the country that we should aspire to be. And I ask the House to reject the motion so we can restore aid to 0.7% and keep the promise that we made to the people of this country and the people of the world.
Pauline Lee.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise really very sadly today because I stood on a manifesto along with everybody else that we would honour that 0.7%, and I was there when we voted on it originally. The people that we are trying to protect have already been hit because our economy went down during the beginning of the COVID pandemic. They're going to be hit, or they continue to be hit again with this reduction to 0.5%, because 0.7% of a figure is a lot more than 0.7%. So we've gone down a huge amount already, and the people are suffering. If we take just a random family with 2 parents and maybe 6 children, 4 of whom are boys and 2 are girls, the girls will be the ones who have less food, and they would benefit from nutritional programs that we provide, but we won't be providing those. The girls would normally get that because the boys are usually prioritised in many families, and they would probably go to school, whereas the girls won't be able to go to school because they won't have the funding to be able to afford it. And the Prime Minister has stood so often on the promise that he will educate all girls with 12 years of quality education. Well, no matter how he protests, that is not going to happen now. And I feel that we are letting down the poorest people in the world. We are just devastating their futures for £4 billion, which we've heard is 1% of what's already been borrowed. It's not a lot of money, and we borrowed that money, and as has been said by many, those people who we should be benefiting will not benefit. They won't have the malaria treatments, they won't have all the neglected tropical disease treatments, they won't have all the help, and especially they will have earlier marriages, they will have younger pregnancies, because we are cutting devastating figures of 85% of the family planning budget and the abortion budget, and that is going to devastate many girls. Many girls will die in early childbirth because of this decision by this government. So I find it shocking that this government is doing that. We are a Conservative government. We decided to spend the 0.7%. We legislated for it, and we are letting those very poorest people down. And I don't see how anybody who has heard the speeches today could vote in all conscience to support what the government want to do with this double lock, because we will never get back to 0.7%.
Go to Wendy Chamberlain. Wendy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to you and members from across this House for their perseverance on this issue. Now, when the government announced last summer that DFID would merge with the then Foreign Commonwealth Office, I and my fellow Liberal Democrats warned of the risk to overseas development assistance and funding. I asked an urgent question to the Foreign Secretary, and I wrote to the DFID Secretary of State on these very issues. And the Secretary of State said at the time, and I quote, "We are committed to the 0.7% of GNI commitment. We want the aid budget and the development know-how and expertise that we have in DFID. It has done a fantastic job at the beating heart of our international decision-making processes." But here we are, Mr. Speaker, 1 year later, and having claimed just last week that the opportunity to vote on this cut to ODA spending had been lost by not being called in the recent Estimates Day debate, I wonder what has caused the government to change its mind and bring forward today's debate at such short notice. Economic circumstances caused by COVID are not the fault of the world's poorest, and we and the many, many charities and NGOs who have contacted me in advance of today's debate know that the poorest will be hardest hit by these cuts. The reality of the COVID pandemic is that no one is safe until everyone is safe. Part of this is sharing of urgently needed vaccines around the world, but it is not only this. We know that global inequalities, that poverty mean that people around the world cannot take the precautions to protect themselves. We can't expect those without access to clean water, 785 million at last count in 2017, to be able to wash their hands for 20 seconds. Slashing development spending is deeply harmful to the notion of global Britain and to us at home. And, Mr. Speaker, it's that this cuts to these fundings also mean cuts to spending within the UK that I think is sometimes lost. ODA funding goes to many places, including our universities who are doing research into how best to tackle the entrenched causes of global inequality and how to support developing countries in order to be self-sufficient. St Andrews University, in my own constituency, is looking up to 50% cuts to some of their active projects, which will impact on the poorest today. These cuts harm not only those in need around the world, but our own research and innovation industries, vital in our response to Brexit and facing the climate crisis. Turning to the government's update, the fiscal tests for development spending presented today are the height of cynicism. They're designed never to be met. As others have said, we have only met these tests once in this century. Conservative MPs must know that by supporting today's motion, it means not returning to 0.7 in this Parliament. And that means that every one of them that supports the government today will be breaking their manifesto promise for 5 years in a row. It's a straight choice. Do we return to 0.7 as we were all elected to this place to do, or do we fail to be the global leaders that the UK has been to this point on this issue? Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm delighted to be called, and I pay enormous tribute to my right honourable friend who's sitting on the front bench today. The Chancellor demonstrated during his career before reaching this place that you can do well by doing good. In working for the Children's Investment Fund Management, he proved that finance, that capitalism can support the world's poorest and can actually change lives. But he will also recognise that even an impressive fund like that, built off a stable platform created by governments, guaranteed by organisations, international bodies and others. And that's why I'm very sorry that I will not be able to support him today, because that platform today is what is so important. That confidence, that ability to rely on a stable platform for the future is absolutely essential. Instead of having that continuity, and instead of having that guarantee of an enduring future, we're going sadly back towards the yo-yo policy. Well, that's not just bad because of the variability. It's bad because it costs more and delivers less. It's frankly inefficient, it is an error, and it undermines our capability. Now, nobody in this House is more passionate about global Britain or Britain's place in the world than me. Nobody believes more that we should have a place at every table, that we should have a voice in every room. But we need to know that we are no longer buying that with gunboats, but with the aid and the effectiveness that we bring.
On that point, the honourable gallant member is making a very impressive speech, and he talks about global Britain. The point of global Britain is about diplomacy, it is about trade, it is about aid, it is about defence. These four things are interconnected to one another. If you reduce one, you have an impact on all, and that is something that will be detrimental from everything from the integrated review to our outside approach.
Yeah. My honourable member is completely correct. And of course, the reality is that we're not living in a vacuum here. We're not taking these decisions with nobody watching. The reality is that our friends are watching and our rivals are watching. As we make this decision and as we change our policy on Afghanistan, as we buy different seats at various UN tables through the diplomacy that we do in sub-Saharan Africa, in Asia and South America, we know that we are changing the rules by which we live. We are literally changing the standards of our modern world by how we buy support, how we develop allies, and how we partner around the world. This, and many people have already spoken about, is of course about the world's poorest, but it's not just about the world's poorest. It's fundamentally about Britain. It's how do we protect ourselves? How do we shape this world? How do we get the standards that make sure British businesses succeed, that make sure British finance shapes the world, that make sure that British rules are those the world lives by? And we do that by making sure we win the votes at the UN, by making sure that we have the voices around the table, that we have the voices of the foreign ministers of countries around the world. Now, we can do it, and I can tell you why we can do it. I can tell you that I know we can do it, because we have done it. For 20 years, we have won debates, we have shaped arguments, and we have defended our position. And we have done it by doing well, by doing good. Exactly as the Chancellor demonstrated in his pre-political career. Now, I can understand why the government might say that actually these targets, these ambitions are too high and that they wish to send a different spending limit. I can understand that. But that's not the argument the government's making. The argument the government's making is the Augustine argument. Lord, make me chaste, but not just yet. Well, if you wish to be holy, choose sanctity. If you wish not to be frank with what you are choosing.
We now go to Liam Byrne.
That was a great speech, Madam Deputy Speaker, and it's a pleasure to follow it. The House doesn't need a former Chief Secretary to the Treasury to lay out that today's motion is a con job, but I'm going to explain that anyway. The Red Book, published in the last budget, shows that public sector net debt is not falling until 2024 at the earliest. But there's no way that a Chancellor, or a Chief Secretary, in fact, would ever make a judgment about whether it was falling sustainably on 1 year alone. That means that this cut is now forecast to stretch way into the next Parliament. And yet the sums we're talking about here are just 0.14% of the national debt stock. And they come at a time when we are putting up defence spending by £24 billion and yet entail a cut of £4 billion to aid spending. We are boasting about our soft power, superpower status, and then slashing into the budget that actually delivers us that soft power. You judge a country's values by its budget, and this aid cut tells you everything you need to know about this government's priorities. The second point I want to make, though, Madam Deputy Speaker, is that this aid cut will cost lives and it will cost livelihoods. The Prime Minister sailed into the G7 very proud of his declaration that he wanted to jab the world and make sure that by the end of next year, the world was safe from COVID. But look, by the end of the G7, the IMF itself was saying that we're something like $23 billion short of what we need for a global vaccination program. This aid cut is not going to help that. It's going to hurt that effort to jab the world. But second, we have got a significant problem now getting the world back on its feet after this pandemic. The IMF thinks that we need something like $200 billion extra in spending to protect the world against COVID and $250 billion of extra investment in climate-friendly investment to help safeguard the recovery. How is this aid cut going to help with that great global project that we've now got to attend to for the years ahead? It's not. It's going to damage the world's efforts to get there, and it's going to damage our efforts to help persuade others to get to that big target. Madam Deputy Speaker, it is 36 years to the day when we celebrated Live Aid. It was an example of how we in this country set out to lead the world to help the world's poorest. On this day of all days, the government is now set to surrender that leadership. We cannot have a rules-based order if we have a Prime Minister who continues to shred the rules. This is a renegade act by a renegade government, and I'll be voting against this motion tonight.
Jeremy Wright.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. There are, I think, two primary arguments for opposing the government this afternoon. The first is that the 0.7% overseas aid target was a manifesto commitment, and that is a serious point, though I do think the electorate will appreciate the expectations on which those manifestos were based have changed substantially since COVID-19. But the second is that the target is in statute in the International Development Official Development Assistance Target Act of 2015. And that is true. But the Act also envisages and allows for circumstances in which the government might not meet the target in any given year, including the impact on public borrowing. And Parliament cannot stop the government doing so. The Act at Section 3, subsection 1 is very clear about that. We only have the right to be informed of how and why the target is to be missed. And as far as I can tell, Madam Deputy Speaker, nobody is proposing to amend the 2015 Act, so it will remain unchanged, whatever the vote this afternoon. Now, I welcome the government's clarification that it is not seeking unilaterally to change the statutory target, but rather to miss it. Those are different things, and the former would, in my view, be both wrong and unlawful. But you either, Madam Deputy Speaker, trust the government or you don't. If you don't trust the government, and we are here because a large number of members do not, then why would you trust it to keep the 0.7% commitment beyond next year when the Act so clearly allows it to decide not to? Transparent, externally judged criteria, arguably at least, would leave those of us who want to see the preservation of aid spending in a stronger position than under the 2015 Act alone, which applies what are in truth fairly loose shackles to government on aid spending and leaves it entirely to government to decide when to escape them. And that cannot help provide the certainty that the aid sector rightly seeks. Madam Deputy Speaker, I believe in the merits of overseas aid spending, and I've used many of the arguments made so eloquently by my right honourable friend for Sutton Coldfield, who deserves, in my view, huge credit for extracting the compromises the government has already made. But these arguments have, in the end, to persuade the public, whose money we are, after all, spending. As Conservatives, we also argue that high public debt is bad for our long-term capacity to support the vulnerable everywhere. And I think enduring public support for aid spending may well depend on the public recognising that we have apportioned the financial burden of the COVID crisis fairly and not protected aid spending to the detriment of other areas of spending they may find at least as deserving. Now, I think the government is now trying to strike that balance, and recognising, though I do, the strength of the arguments made by many on both sides of this House in the course of this debate, I think it important and necessary to give them credit for that effort.
Humanitarian. Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The government's decision to renege on its international obligations rides roughshod over those ring-fenced commitments and puts at risk of millions across the globe. It's not in our national interest, and it's certainly not in our national security interest to do that, and that's before we even take into consideration our moral duty as a nation to alleviate global poverty. And damningly, several former Prime Ministers, who themselves proudly upheld our country's aid commitments, have also voiced their concerns about this government's handling of its international aid obligations. Indeed, we heard earlier today the Right Honourable Member for Maidenhead has committed to voting against a three-line Conservative whip for the first time ever. So powerfully does she feel about this issue. And when the Right Honourable Member spoke in this debate, she was crystal clear what the aid cuts would mean when she said fewer girls will be educated, more boys and girls will become slaves, more children will go hungry, and more of the poorest people in the world will die. A damning indictment from a former Conservative Prime Minister. The UK has a long and proud track record of stepping up and supporting those in need. We cannot abandon our responsibilities to those around the world who are most poverty-stricken, least of all now in a global pandemic. The UK is currently the only G7 country to commit in legislation to spending 0.7% of gross national income on international development, a target set by the United Nations, and is the second largest international development donor behind only the US. And that is right and proper that is a fact. The extended families of many of my Ilford South constituents directly benefit from UK aid, lifting millions of their extended families out of illiteracy, poverty, and providing so much support to some of the poorest communities around the globe, including Bangladesh, Pakistan, India, and Sri Lanka. However, instead of leading by example, this government has now shamefully been the only G7 nation to cut its aid budget this year. There could be no clearer argument against cutting aid than the devastating impact of the COVID response. In April this year, the Delta variant was ravaging India. Vital coronavirus research centres, including a project tracking variants in India, had had its funding reduced by up to 70%, leading its project lead to say the cut would not only make vitally important projects unviable, but in effect would kill it dead. Then in May, the Tropical Health and Education Trust criticised the UK government for slashing £48 million in global healthcare funding as part of its wider cuts. Indeed, those plans to donate 6 million items of PPE ordered by the British NHS to healthcare workers fighting new variants across the world were held up, yet again preventing a containment of the virus. We have a duty to act, Madam Deputy Speaker. We must do so now before it's too late for millions who rely on that direct aid. This is not about giving a man a fish to feed himself, but giving a net to provide for himself. It's about enabling, indeed, our historic obligation to lift up the global south using our nation's far greater resources. I welcome the actions of our colleagues on the opposite side of the House who will today vote with us in voting against this callous and awful manoeuvre by the government. Bim Afalami.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. This is a very difficult debate today, Madam Deputy Speaker, because we all on both sides of the House know what good UK aid spending does. We are all proud of what we've been able to achieve with our aid spending. And it doesn't just help in and of itself, it also helps the British taxpayer, it helps British people, because by investing in areas like education and vaccination and supporting local economies, we stop some of those problems washing up to British shores, and we understand that. But this debate is really about, when you get underneath all of it, it's really about competing political necessities, competing political choices. On the one hand, we have a real need as a responsible government in fiscal terms, as we come out of the COVID pandemic, of which we already know how many hundreds of billions has been spent. There's a need to make sure that we get our day-to-day spending, our current spending back in balance. There's a need to make sure that our debt ends up falling as a percentage of GDP, because that public spending that is only necessary, which is only possible when those things are there, is what supports all of the vulnerable people in this country, all British taxpayers everywhere, as much as poorest people in the world with aid spending. But at the same time, there is also a need to make sure we help the poorest people in the world, and that is the balance that we are trying to strike here, and I believe the government has struck the right one. Now, there have been some members have talked about the fiscal, these tests that the government has set, and somehow have suggested that they've only been met once in the last 20 years. I've actually taken a look at this. Both tests have been met the year 2000 to 2001, 2001 to 2002, 2018 to 2019. And if I'm right, though the Chancellor may correct me if I'm wrong, the underlying debt in the years before the pandemic fell for, I think, 4 years in a row. So it is not true that somehow these are impossible tests. But even if you didn't believe me, Madam Deputy Speaker, the key part of this, and why I respect and accept this compromise position, is that these are transparent and clear criteria. Everybody knows what it is. We can judge it independently, and the OBR, as we all know and trust, is an organisation perfectly capable of doing that. And the last thing I'll say is, it's not just important how much money we spend. It's also important how we spend it. What I'd like to see with our aid budget is more of that money, not just with multinationals, which does a lot of good work, but smaller charities working on the ground. Charities like Harpend and Spotlight on Africa, based in my constituency, that does fantastic work in rural Uganda. Because having seen the work they do on the ground, working with bigger multinationals and the Ugandan government, can do fantastic things. And I'd like to see that spend that we have at 0.5% temporarily, that spend go more to some of those grassroots organisations so we can spend our money even more effectively so that we get more for what we're doing.
Ruth Jones.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I would like to say it's a pleasure to speak in this debate, but that would not be true because I am appalled that we're having to vote on this proposal at all. This cut to our international aid budget reflects badly on us all, not just this government, and portrays the UK as inward-looking and self-serving. This is a Tory manifesto promise that is going to be broken, and broken very publicly, as the whole world is watching. I wonder how the Prime Minister will have the bottle to attend COP26 and call for other countries to raise finances for climate action when he's in charge of a government that's cutting its own contribution. Surely the ultimate act of hypocrisy. Madam Deputy Speaker, if this overseas aid funding was going to finance vanity projects, trips to the moon or high-flying, cutting-edge, dodgy ventures, then I could begin to understand the reasoning behind the decision. But none of the projects fall into those categories. They are basic health and social care projects that currently benefit millions of people across the poorer countries on our planet. The money funds basic projects like polio eradication, sexual health advice, the clearing of landmines, education programmes, the provision of clean water and sanitation, the prevention of sexual exploitation of women and girls. The money funds training programmes like the NHS Overseas Training Scheme, which trained 78,000 healthcare workers in Nepal, Uganda, Ethiopia, Bangladesh and Myanmar. Many projects will now come to an end and affect lives in countries such as Afghanistan, Syria, Somaliland, Nigeria and so many more. So by cutting the funding to these numerous projects, this government is going to cause many unnecessary deaths. This is a scandal, and we need to highlight this callous approach taken today. And before members opposite say, oh, it's just Labour members whinging again, let's have a look at the people who are calling for a reversal of their cuts. Tory ministers such as Ruth Davidson, Baroness Sugg, who resigned from the government in November over these planned cuts, and Alok Sharma. There are other world leaders, my apologies. And there are other world leaders condemning the cuts, including Samantha Power, head of US Aid. Malala, who calls on the Prime Minister, to keep his promise of helping 40 million girls go to school, and the Archbishop of Canterbury, who describes the Chancellor's decision as shameful and wrong. Interestingly, every Prime Minister still alive is also opposed to the plan. These are big hitters and their condemnation is very clear. So I would urge the current Prime Minister and the Chancellor to think again, go back to the drawing board and plan a different route, one that doesn't disadvantage millions of peoples in the countries less affluent than our own. So this isn't fair and it isn't right. Madam Deputy Speaker, I want to be very clear. I will be voting against this government's plan to cut the overseas aid budget by £4 billion this year, and I would urge honourable members opposite to do the same, because the world is watching. Thank you.
David Warburton.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'm very pleased that the House has this opportunity both to debate and to determine this question. I've always defended our aid budget, and I do not think that we should search for economies at the expense of the most vulnerable globally and at the expense of our own reputation and influence globally. I don't need to rehearse the case for ODA spending. It's vaccination of 55 million people. It's saving of an incredible 10 million children from hunger. It's help in providing 50 million people with the means to climb out of poverty. And I don't need to describe the soft power benefits. Its influence for Britain culturally, diplomatically, politically, its symbolic significance, and its demonstration of leadership. I could not, therefore, support the reduction of the spending when its return to 0.7% was effectively at the whim or under the control of the government. No matter how strong the intent might be to raise it again, events are always likely to overtake and overcome good intentions. So I'm very grateful to my right honourable friend, the Chancellor, for the conversations that we've had in recent days. And given the uncertainty in the economy, I entirely understand his reluctance to offer a date for the restoration of the 0.7. But a set of conditions, it seemed to me, would provide a solution that would provide a pathway governed by objective circumstances, and ceding control of that mechanism to the OBR and basing it on conditions which were met as recently as 2018-19 and forecasted by the OBR in 2018, 19 and 20 to be met in the following financial year. These conditions do provide that pathway back to both our manifesto commitment and our duty to the poorest in the world. The Treasury is effectively outsourcing its spending decisions to the OBR and to the state of the public finances, something which I don't believe has happened before. And this, I think, does provide us with the certainty that we need to know that the cut is temporary and our commitment for 0.7% will be upheld, and it ensures that our public finances are protected. And this not only provides us with a route back, but ensures that the current position is transitory. So I will be supporting this motion because the worth of a commitment is whether or not it's upheld in the face of challenges, and this allows us to meet our challenges and meet our commitments.
We now go to Geraint Davis.
Madam Deputy Speaker, there's no economic or moral justification for cutting overseas aid from the richest to the poorest at this most desperate time in the eye of the pandemic storm that spreads death, disease and hunger like a wildfire through developing nations. Imagine looking at your children starving in front of you, huddled in a tent in the blistering heat of Afghanistan, Yemen or Syria. Or as you think about the cars and the houses and the fridges and Netflix of people in the West. Or looking at your daughter who could help create a better world with an education who won't get one. Or your parents who've just died from COVID. This poverty, this ignorance, this disease can be helped by us by reinstating the aid budget. And as host of the G7 and COP26, we should be taking moral leadership. Let's be clear. We can afford those to help those in greatest need more, not less, because the cost of UK borrowing is down, not up since the pandemic. Why? because the global interest rates are down, so our borrowing costs are down from 37 billion in 2019-20 to 23 billion in 2021. That's a £14 billion saving in spending on debt interest for the UK, but aid spending is still being cut by 4.4 billion. And the Prime Minister's just said every pound we spend in aid has to be borrowed. But we can afford more aid now because our borrowing costs, our costs on savings on debt interest are massively down. Now is the time to invest, to build back better in the developing world out of the pandemic, to invest in climate change adaptation with new green industries that will help all our environments. Now in a low interest world is the time to borrow and invest. £1 million cut in aid could instead be reinstated and service a debt of £100 million investment, but only the G7 can borrow at such low interest rates. Developing nations cannot. And so it's no use saying we can't afford it this year due to the pandemic. So maybe we'll reinstate money in future years. We can afford it this year. And now is when it's needed most. If savings were needed, and they're not, they should be made after the pandemic, when the poorest are back on their feet, not in their darkest hour of need. And we know the politics of popular nationalism. We know 7.6 million people in the UK are now in hunger. So of course people are saying charity begins at home, but that hunger is unnecessary too. And we shouldn't give other G7 nations the excuse to cut their aid. We need more aid, not less. Britain is better than this. Let's make the world better. Let's reinstate our aid budget now.
Thank you very much indeed, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'm glad to see the Chancellor in his place. I've got a couple of specific questions for him on science policy. But in the context of the debate in which we're taking place in today, I'm very proud of our leadership and our contribution to supporting people right across the world, and I voted enthusiastically for the Act of Parliament that brought in the 0.7 commitment into law, and pay tribute to my right honourable friend for his work in that. But he will know that in so doing, the Act of Parliament specifically anticipated circumstances in which temporarily the 0.7% target may not be made, including, and I quote from the Act, any substantial change in gross national income, and fiscal circumstances, in particular the likely impact of the target on taxation and public spending and public borrowing. It's hard, Madam Deputy Speaker, not to consider that the circumstances that we are experiencing fall plumb into line with what the framers of the legislation and those who supported it had in mind. Of course, I'll give way to my right honourable friend.
I'm most grateful to my right honourable friend. I was involved in the drafting of the Act, and I do not believe that that is what we intended with those clauses. But let me also say this to him. Has he noticed that the Governor of the Bank of England has said that the economy will have been restored to pre-COVID levels, I think, next month? Doesn't he think that's a very significant indicator of why we shouldn't be doing what the government would like us to do today?
Well, I'm very grateful to my right honourable friend, and I quite agree that that is an encouraging assessment, not least for the prospects of our returning to the 0.7%. I studied very carefully the Hansard transcripts of the debate, and indeed some of the criticism was that the criteria might be insufficiently precise. And so I do think that the innovation of establishing in advance and giving to the OBR the trigger for the return is a sensible course, and indeed they mirror more or less the fiscal rules that were once called the fiscal mandate that were in place at the time that the Act of Parliament was originally adopted. So I want it back, and I hope, as the Governor does, that will be sooner rather than later, and that the Chancellor will be able to confirm that is his firm intention, as I think is clear from what he said in the written statement. But my questions on science are twofold. The science budget is very importantly increasing from around 9 billion a year in 2017 to 22 billion a year from 2024-5. And that includes, as it always has done, ODA, includes overseas development assistance. Will the Chancellor specifically reiterate the commitment to achieving that £22 billion by 2024-25? And secondly, will he reassure me that a report that I read, that the 0.5% limit on ODA could somehow prevent us engaging in international scientific research projects that we were perfectly willing to fund because they are excellent and are justified as part of that budget that is rising to £22 billion. Because we all know that science is inherently international. The best science is global, and the best teams are often international teams. And it would be a concern, a grave concern, if that 0.5% target would in any way be a cap on international collaboration. Knowing my right honourable friend, the Chancellor's commitment to science and technology, I can't believe that that is his intention. So his commitment to the 22 billion budget and his reassurance that this will not be a cap will be very important in establishing that the science aspects can continue, and that is in effect the removal of a ring fence rather than the limitation of international scientific research.
Speaker, the Prime Minister told the House earlier that there was common ground in the House. I think he's right, but I suspect he's not standing on that common ground, listening to contributions from across the way. And I pay tribute to the Right Honourable Gentleman from Sutton Coldfield for the courage that he and other fellow Honourable and Right Honourable members on the other side have shown in standing up for this issue consistently, but also, I have to say, standing up for their manifesto along with the rest of us. And the government has a good story to tell on this issue, if it wanted to, on Gavi, for example, on their support for education for women and girls. And I do wonder why they don't want to tell this story to the country. I think because too many of them are ashamed of it, and because, as the Right Honourable Gentleman from Sutton Coldfield said before, they're playing to a gallery, but they're playing to the wrong gallery, and it is a dangerous game that they are playing. The proposals before the House today, they are myopic and they are mean-minded. Mean-minded because we see that this is a trick, it's a fiscal trap. We were promised a straight up and down vote, we weren't given one, instead we were given this little twisting mechanism. Mean-minded too because, as we've heard, it will cost lives to make this cut, and because it is already a smaller cut to what would have been a smaller cake anyway. The amount of money had already gone down. To cut it further is simply mean. And you can't, with any of these programmes, you can't simply turn the taps on, turn the taps off and turn the taps back on again. The damage that will be done to British overseas aid programmes will carry on much longer after we restore the 0.7%, if under this proposed mechanism we ever did restore it. It'll set programmes back, it'll set research and development back, including, incidentally, for my constituents. I have a constituent who works in water purification, I have a constituent who works in energy, localised energy matters. These cuts will have an effect overseas. Let's be clear, they'll have cut effects in this country as well, in terms of innovation and our ability to take technologies across the world. It will have effects in areas such as the polio eradication programme, where, as my right honourable friend from Leeds has said, we've got to cuts of 95%, will put that programme back. And it's myopic, for the reasons that have already been said by my right honourable friend, the Leader of the Opposition, Honourable Gentleman from Tonbridge and Melling, because it will damage British soft power. The British Council tell me that they will lose 15 to 20% of staff and unable to carry out the programmes in the countries abroad where we need to be influencing. And also because it will affect our strategic position, as Leader of the Opposition has said. And let's put it in this, I think that overseas aid is a moral issue. But if we can't look at it like that, let's be clear. Our enemies and our adversaries, our Russia and China for our adversaries, our enemies IQ and IS, will fill the gap if we don't. And it will simply make matters worse in the long run. This is a short-sighted, short-termist cut. It's mean-minded. And I pay tribute to the Right Honourable Gentleman for his leadership, but I have to tell you, I won't be accepting it tonight.
We now go to Saki Bharti.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I want to start by acknowledging the excellent speeches by a number of honourable members who've so passionately set out the case for overseas development assistance. In particular, my right honourable friend, the member for Sutton Coldfield, very eloquently and characteristically passionately has made the case for the ODA budget. And in normal times, I would be with him in this debate. However, today I support the government's decision. And I'm a big believer in the role of international aid and how it shows the world what we stand for as a nation. Through our role on the global stage is amplified by our magnanimity through international aid. And in a world with ever increasing threats, our overseas development assistance budget represents a tool through which the United Kingdom can demonstrate its generosity, its moral strength, its friendship, and its nobility. When considering this, one can understand why it evokes so much passion from all sides of the House. Indeed, Madam Deputy Speaker, many of my constituents have spoken to me about the importance they place on the ODA budget. But time and time again, they have said to me, we know it's been a difficult time. We know we must manage the economy. We know we must pay the bills. And as my right honourable friend, the Chancellor, has already laid out, we cannot ignore the state our economy is in after the worst crisis since the last two world wars. To have borrowed over £300 billion, the equivalent of 14.3% of our GDP, well, Madam Deputy Speaker, it's clear that difficult decisions have to be made. And in this context, I do understand why the government has had to make this temporary cut. But in my view, it must be temporary. And with the clarity offered by the Treasury, I believe it will be. Of course, we must repair our economy. This is not a controversial thing. It is simply what is expected of us by the British people. We also continue to spend almost £10 billion as part of the overseas development assistance budget if this cut is to go through. But the British people also expect strong public services and efficiency from government. And so difficult decisions are inevitable and they obviously have to be made. And we also continue to demonstrate our soft power through other means. The distribution of the vaccine is an excellent example of this. Due to the government's investment, there were 500 million doses available to 168 countries, all distributed at no profit. By the end of the year, we will have distributed 3 billion doses. British ingenuity and British generosity. Finally, in a world of finite resources and increasing strains on our economy, we must make sure that our ODA budget is being deployed effectively and projects should be subject to the highest levels of scrutiny. In other words, it should not just be important how much we spend, but how we spend that money. Outcomes matter. The effectiveness of the budget should not be measured purely in monetary terms, but against robust targets, which are set to achieve our objectives and ultimately make the world a better place.
22 has withdrawn, so we go to Alicia Cairns.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'm enormously proud of our record on supporting the most vulnerable and using aid to make our people and those around the world safer. But we have suffered the biggest recession in 300 years, and that's not a situation that we could have predicted when I fought the election on our manifesto promises. And yet the International Development Act 2015 explicitly anticipated this sort of crisis where a departure from targets is necessary. Now, if you'd asked me during the election whether I would have reconsidered this commitment to 0.7%, I would have said yes, but only in the very darkest of times. And if the last year or so has not been the darkest of times, then what is? Since my election, we've had to make an enormously large amount of difficult choices. And those difficult choices and dark times, in Rutland and Melton, they look like the government having to support 17,900 jobs through furlough, 4,500 individuals, underwrite nearly £123 million in loans. That's almost half of all jobs, employee jobs in Rutland and Melton that we had to save. And that support was necessary, but the costs pose real risks for the future too. Now, even with the reduction in UK aid, we remain the second largest donor in the G7. The taxes of residents of Rutland and Melton will continue to go towards saving lives, disaster relief, peacekeeping and climate. And we should be proud of that. And I hope the reorganisation of the FCDO can augment our capacity to respond to crises outside of the ODA budget through the new conflict centre. But today in the Chamber, honourable members have criticised the government, arguing that other G7 countries are not temporarily reducing their ODA budget. But in 2020, we were one of only 2 G7 countries to meet that target, and the only one to do it since 2013 every year. Perhaps it's because those countries have not met their commitments in normal times, but they do not now need to make a temporary reduction. Indeed, they had no plans in the first place to meet the 0.7% they promised. With this temporary reduction, we will still exceed the funding provided by every country, bar one. We will remain one of the most generous countries in the world. This is a temporary measure. It is one that recognises the fiscal duty we have to our children. It recognises that we will still stand by those most in need. And the government has defined the fiscal circumstances under which we will return to 0.7%. This does not diminish us as a country, and whilst this is a difficult decision, it is the right one for now because we have faced the darkest of times. Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker.
Smith.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The SNP opposes these cuts, as my good friend from Dundee West eloquently outlined. We are committed to our 0.7% manifesto commitment. 98.2% of the votes cast in the Stirling election in 2019 went to parties committed to the 0.7%. I am representing my party and my constituency in taking the stance that we have. Now, we would pay tribute and warmly praise a number of the members on the government benches. We've really seen some refreshing blasts of integrity throughout this discussion, and this is too important for Punch and Judy politics. Now, there's 3 points I'd make because this has been a well-trodden path by this point in the debate. Firstly, 0.7% for the government is a manifesto commitment that was made barely 18 months ago. Yes, point 2, COVID has changed everything. It has, of course. It's changed everything for everybody else as well. And to use COVID as a pretext for this cut when the developing world is also dealing with COVID and the effects of the economic impact is reprehensible, to my mind. The cut is, thirdly, out of step with the rest of the world. The UK is the outlier in this. Other countries are increasing their aid spending, not decreasing it. Now, the UK remains, as we've heard, a significant donor of international aid. I applaud that, I welcome that, I acknowledge that. But this is a broken promise to the poorest people in the world at the worst possible time. And as I say, it flies in the face of the global consensus. Canada is increasing their spend by 28%, where the UK is decreasing it by 25%. France increasing theirs by 36%, Italy by 13%, the US by 39.4%, Germany by 6%. It is the UK that is out of step. Now, Global Britain is clearly not the SNP's project, but we are engaged in this because we don't want to see the poorest in the world let down, and we want to try and rectify a mistake to see Scottish taxes, or more realistically Scottish debt, go to effective purposes rather than where this government might take it. We are entirely unconvinced by the government's compromise proposal. We think to present this as an arithmetic formula is to misrepresent this issue entirely. It's been acknowledged throughout this debate, and estimates, of course, on numbers can be arguable, but only once in the last 20 years have the criteria foreseen within the government's mechanism been met. We fear this is a formula to entrench the cuts, not to bring them back. Now, the books do need to be balanced, of course they do, and I feel for the government in that task. But the difference we're talking about between 0.5 and 0.7 is barely 1% of the global sum. So for the government that has spent money on increasing defence spend, increasing nuclear capacity, blowing £1.3 billion on a needless stamp duty freeze, and yet worse, is talking about a royal yacht, I think the priorities are wrong, and I do hope a significant number of the members opposite will join the coalition to put this right. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. It's a pleasure to follow the member for Stirling. I've been speaking to my constituents in Derbyshire Dales about this. They are, by and large, a very generous and kindly-spirited people. I've listened carefully to their views today. Following those discussions, I will be voting for today's motion, as it will provide certainty and a path for international spending, clearly outlining that path back to our 0.7 manifesto commitment, while delivering responsible public finances and allowing us to maintain a high level of spending on other priorities at home, such as the NHS, schools and the police. It is also delivering our manifesto promises for responsible public finances. At 0.5%, the UK is spending over £10 billion in overseas aid this year. This is a phenomenal amount of money. We are one of the most generous and kindest and biggest spenders in the world. Let's not forget that. And I would like to remind those who wish to unfairly characterise this Conservative government as somehow being mean or uncaring on overseas aid, that Conservative governments have consistently spent more on international aid than Labour. Between 1997 and 2009, under Labour governments, the average spend on overseas aid was just 0.36%. So the opposition are hardly in a position to lecture this government on overseas spending. The leader of the opposition may find it helpful in court, but those arguments don't work here. Once again, the opposition is totally out of tune with the British population. We believe, on balance, we have to balance the spending of this unusual time that the government's had with the COVID pandemic spending. The government has spent over £400 billion on keeping this nation safe, keeping our families secure, preserving jobs and livelihoods. This has given the people of my constituency in Derbyshire Dales a way forward in very frightening and worrying times. On behalf of the people of Derbyshire Dales, I do thank the government for this support, and it is kind and it is not mean. We must not forget that every pound we spend in international aid is borrowed. My adult sons remind me of this regularly. This money is borrowed from our future generations. As a mother of 4 adult children and representing many, many families in Derbyshire Dales, I feel I have a duty to restore and help restore the public finances to some sort of responsible level. It's for these reasons I have no hesitation in supporting this sound motion today.
We now go to Stephen Timms.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. We've had a 20-year cross-party consensus on aid that we should meet the 0.7% of GNI, the UN target. I very much regret that that consensus has been lost. Of course, when GDP goes down, our aid budget will go down. But the pandemic is no justification for reducing the proportion of national income committed to international aid. In a fine speech, the Right Honourable Member for Sutton Coldfield referred to the strength of Christian aid in Chesham and Amersham. As a Treasury Minister in the late 90s, I saw the churches play the key role in securing that cross-party consensus. They were the instigators of Jubilee 2000, ahead of the millennium, and the key supporters of Make Poverty History afterwards. And those campaigns led on to the historic 2005 Gleneagles deal, writing off $40 billion worth of debts owed by 18 highly indebted poor countries. The idea of cancelling unpayable debts inspired people and drew people together. Rooted in teaching in the Bible, it had a dramatic impact on government policy and on the lives of millions. Last month, I joined a number of MPs on a virtual trip to Togo, organised by the Christian charity Compassion UK. We visited their UK aid-funded child survival project. The situation in Togo is desperate. Under 5 mortality is among the worst in the world. 1 in 25 babies don't reach the age of 1. Women have a 1 in 58 chance of dying in pregnancy or childbirth. Compassion's work, supported by UK aid, is starting to change things. In the first year, the project reached over 4,000 people in extreme poverty. The number of full-term healthy babies delivered was 24% above target. UK development aid helps save lives amongst the world's poorest people. We met somebody called Amma. She registered in the programme when she was 7 months pregnant. She was struggling to feed her existing children. When she reached full term, her husband left suddenly. She also had malaria. Her baby and her own life were at risk. The Child Survival Project provided food and hygiene support. Her expenses were paid. She gave birth to a son, and she's since been able to set up a business of her own. Even a small amount of aid saves lives. The cuts to UK aid put thousands of projects like those run by Compassion UK in Togo at risk. I really hope Parliament will reject this motion.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'm very grateful to be called in this debate this afternoon. I recognise that the Chancellor of the Exchequer has probably the most difficult job of anybody in the government, perhaps in the whole country, bar none. He's the only person employed to say no and make difficult choices about all of the different spending demands that all of us present at the door of the Treasury. But nevertheless, Madam Deputy Speaker, I do share the concerns and the fears of those colleagues who this afternoon have expressed doubt and concern that the cuts that we are debating will be become permanent. And that I also share the fear that 0.5% spending becomes the default setting for our overseas aid spending, and the cuts become locked in. They become permanent, a permanent withdrawal, a permanent stepping back of the level of commitment that Britain has given overseas amongst the poorest countries on earth. And the reason that I share these fears is for some of the reasons that have already been outlined this afternoon, but also, Madam Deputy Speaker, because I think we're in danger of overlooking just how enormous was the effort that got us to the point where we as a House, as the House of Commons, were united on making that commitment to 0.7. And the member for East Ham has just reminded us of it then. I was perhaps one of the few members here this afternoon who was in the House in 2005, and I recall the enormous lobbying efforts that were being made, not just by the churches, but by trade unions, women's institutes, groups in all of our constituencies. There was demand for this. And it required opposition frontbenchers to work with government frontbenchers. It required opposition backbenchers to work with government backbenchers. And for me, it represented a really high watermark of what can be achieved from this House of Commons when people choose to bury some of their political differences and work together for a cause that's much bigger than our most immediate political needs.
Thank my right honourable very much for giving way. He's making a wonderful speech. Does he remember, he referred to his longevity in the House, does he remember with me Make Poverty History and the way it galvanised national opinion? And does he accept that Beat the Crises, Crack the Crises, which is the current successor to that generation, reinforced by younger people, once COVID is over and they are able to show what they feel, they will make very clear their opposition to this foolish decision that the government has made?
My right honourable friend makes a very strong point. And he's right, there was this popular movement behind it. But nevertheless, Madam Deputy Speaker, it wasn't universally popular. There were staunch critics inside this House, critics outside the House, sections of the press absolutely hated it. And as we went through the financial crisis of 2009-2010, the criticisms became louder. And as the ripples from that crisis have kind of moved through our politics over the last 11 years, it's become increasingly difficult to keep making that case for investing 0.7% of our GNI in helping the world's poorest people. But I'm proud of the fact, Madam Deputy Speaker, that we chose to stick to that. Even when we were making very difficult decisions and choices about other aspects of public spending, we took a decision that actually spending more on the people with the very least globally was the right thing to do. And it was the right thing to do then in the wake of the last financial crisis. And I believe it's still the right thing to do now as we're going through this awful pandemic. And yes, we face a moment in our politics where we have enormous pressures on our public finances. And I made those remarks about the Chancellor of the Exchequer very sincerely at the start. But what is a difficult moment for us fiscally and politically, it's an absolutely tragic, devastating moment for the poorest people around the world, for whom the pandemic has been the cause of another wave of dire poverty and suffering. And that's what we're really debating here this afternoon. These are not difficult issues, and there have been sincere speeches being made on either side of the argument. And I'm very sad, Madam Deputy Speaker, that I won't be able to support my government this afternoon. But as I said, I think that 0.7% commitment we made all those years ago was the right thing to do, and I pay tribute to my right honourable friend, the member for Sutton Coldfield, for the role that he played. But sticking to it now is still the right thing to do.
Yeah.
Madam Deputy Speaker, the Prime Minister brought a very sombre tone to the dispatch box this afternoon, trying to convince us that this decision was all a regrettable consequence of the economic output of the pandemic. But that rings hollow when we remember the glee with which he stood at the dispatch box this time last year and announced the abolition of DFID, when he described aid and DFID as a giant cash point in the sky. When, as Foreign Secretary, we remember that he quoted Kipling in a Buddhist temple in Myanmar, or when he was a journalist and he used the language of Pekingese and watermelon smiles. This is a Prime Minister and a government who know little and care less about the struggles of poverty, whether at home or abroad, and the life-saving, life-changing difference that aid can and does make around the world. A bit like the evil standing orders that we're debating later today, the aid budget to them is just another part of David Cameron's legacy that they seem so keen to bury. I think the Prime Minister likes the fact that he's the only living Prime Minister that supports the cut in the aid budget. It's part of this year zero hard rain approach to the UK consensus that has existed for so long, a consensus that saw every single member, as we've said, of this House elected to the commitment of 0.7%, a consensus that has existed for 20 years, a target that has been met consistently since 2013. 0.5% is completely arbitrary. 0.7% was calculated by international organisations when it was set in the 1970s. 0.5% is completely arbitrary. We've not heard why it's not 0.4% or 0.6% or 0.3%. It's simply, it sounds good. It sounds like the government is taking decisive action, and that seems to be their attitude to so many aspects of government just now. Never mind the impact or the feasibility. Yes.
I'm grateful to him, and he's making some very serious points, but does he accept that, in fact, it's the UK who set out 0.7% in law? Many countries around the world also commit to 0.7%, but always fall short and don't bother to have a discussion about it.
But the UK is now resigning from that. The government is resigning. It won't even give us a legally binding vote on the decision to resign from that commitment that was agreed by the entire House. And what we consistently hear from the dispatch box is soft power, superpower is about global leadership. And in a year when the UK should be taking leadership, it's taking a step backwards. And of course, the decision to cut aid is being shown to be doubly problematic because aid was due to fall anyway. GNI was falling as a result of pandemic-related economic contraction anyway, and there would have been tough decisions and funding squeezes, but these would have been predictable and manageable. And this notion that it's all being paid for by debt, well, you could say that about all kinds of aspects of government savings. All governments around the world run debts and deficits, and they invest for the future. And aid is an investment in all of our collective futures. But what is happening now in real time is that drastic sweeping cuts have already been made to get down to this completely arbitrary target of 0.5%, and these will be massively difficult to undo. And despite today's attempt to bounce the House into a decision, the government's own rhetoric and all these other shenanigans, the government's own rhetoric doesn't add up. The Prime Minister repeatedly says that the COVID investment it's making is going to be additional. Well, if it's going to be additional, then how can the government spend 0.5%? It must be spending more than 0.5%. And if it's not additional, then what else is going to be cut? It doesn't make any sense. And I didn't get an answer in the last debate either about the concerns raised about UK aid match. The public have been donating in good faith £1 to certain charities on the basis that the UK government would match that, and those charities have now been told, such as Mary's Meals, have now been told this funding would be delayed, and they'll be wondering whether it will ever appear at all. Hundreds of constituents in Glasgow North have contacted me about this since the cut was first announced, and that speaks to thousands of activists and organisations across the country. Aid works best when it is stable and predictable in the long term. There will be no undoing some of the damage caused by the UK government's cuts that have been hastily and in some cases disastrously implemented. A return to 0.7% ASAP will at least mitigate some of that damage, and I hope some of the Tories who have been opposed to the government's decision so far will continue to show resilience so that they vote tonight to restore our aid commitment to our poorest brothers and sisters around the world.
Ruth Edwards.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I didn't come into this House to reduce overseas aid. But then I also didn't come here to tell people that they can't see their parents or their grandchildren, that they had to close the business they've spent years building up, or that they couldn't get married with their friends and family there to support them. These are just some of the soul-searching choices that COVID has forced on all of us in the last 18 months. And today's choice is no different. Voting for the government's motion will take £5 billion out of the overseas aid budget. Voting against it will cut £5 billion out of our public services here in the UK, or necessitate tax rises on our constituents, many of whom have been living on restrained incomes over the pandemic. It's important that we're honest with our constituents, especially at a time when the NHS has got a huge task to get a backlog of millions of operations and treatments down, when so many children have had their education so badly disrupted, and when the police are dealing with a chilling rise in crimes like domestic violence. Now, there have been some suggestions in this debate here today. My right honourable friend, the member for Halton Price and Howden, has suggested cutting HS2. No doubt very popular in some places, but something that many of my business leaders throughout the East Midlands has made clear
will significantly degrade the ability to grow the economy there. The Right Honourable Gentleman, the member for Dundee West, has suggested degrading our cyber capabilities at a time when our public services, when our businesses, when our society is increasingly reliant on digital infrastructure and digital services. So there are no easy choices here. There are no cost-free options. The second point I want to make, Madam Deputy Speaker, is that the definition of ODA is very narrow. It excludes much of the support the UK provides overseas from being included in it. £85 million invested to help develop the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine, which is now being distributed without profit across the world. We are the largest donor to Gavi, immunising 300 million children against infectious diseases, and we provide £350 million a year to the UN's peacekeeping budget on top of our ODA contributions. And finally, Madam Deputy Speaker, even with the reduction to 0.5%, the UK will spend more as a percentage of GNI than almost any other major economy, more than the US, Canada, Japan, and well above the OECD average. We will still be the third largest bilateral humanitarian donor in the world. So to talk about Britain as if it's withdrawing from the world or turning its back on people is, in my view, divorced from reality.
Fiscal.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I, first of all, like others, would wish to pay tribute to individuals on the government benches who have brought us here because of their tenacity, who have shown the courage of their convictions, convictions that the government claimed to hold, but despite the obfuscation of the Prime Minister, are seeking to renege on, which is why I think this debate, as I say, is so welcome. It is an opportunity to rehearse the arguments that we've had before and others have said today. They remain. The principles still remain and the arguments still apply. It still is a situation that it is in our own economic self-interest to ensure that we remain committed to point 7. It is environmentally necessary, especially with the spectre of COP26 arising. It is also the case that international aid is a right, not a charity given by us. It's something that we need to repay for historical acts. But there are two primary arguments, two twin imperatives that I think apply, and they're the arguments I wish to make. First of all, there's the moral imperative that this is for humanity. We are all part of the human race and we require to look after our sisters and brothers wherever they are, whatever nationality or passport they hold, even whatever colour that passport may be. Equally, it's a necessity of public health, which is in fact the corollary of that, because it's in our own self-interest that we carry out these actions. Dealing first of all with the moral argument, it's been made quite clear by many others, quite eloquently, that this will be catastrophic. And it's not enough for the Prime Minister to say that this is a once-in-a-century event. It will be repeated, as we have seen with variants, and indeed we will face other health challenges if the Third World continues to face the problems that it does. That is why we have to address it. They are unable to deal as we are, despite the challenges that we're already facing. We've seen what happened in Africa with AIDS. The consequences for Africa of coronavirus are horrendous. It's therefore a moral imperative that we take actions to ensure that we protect them as well as protecting us, because that takes us on to the public health argument. Because if we do not address this issue there, then it will come here. We've already mentioned, as I said earlier in the speech, we've had Delta variants, we'll have other variants, we'll have even other variants that won't be capable of protecting us by the vaccinations that we've had. If it isn't the coronavirus outbreak, it will be some other form of ill health that will challenge humanity. And therefore we have to ensure that we take every step possible to ensure that not only do we protect ourselves, but we protect everybody. Because by protecting everybody, we do protect ourselves. People will march, people will come, people will ill, and people will be infected. If the border force can't keep out drugs, they won't be able to keep out individuals and an illness. It's therefore in our own interest to ensure that we carry out that moral imperative, which is quite right for the benefit of society, for all of us, and equally for our own individual benefit in our own land, and indeed individually, we protect the public health of this country.
Peter Bone.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and it's a great pleasure to follow the honourable member for East Lothian, who speaks with passion. I don't accept his arguments, but I do accept that those people that will vote against the government tonight do so in genuine concern. And I also welcome the fact that we've got a lot of SNP members here, we've got the DUP here, we've got Liberal Democrats. But only 2 Labour backbenchers are bothered to stay in the debate, and only one has just arrived. So I'm not so sure about the concerns expressed from the Labour benches. But I do welcome one thing that the honourable gentleman said, is the fact that this Parliament is having a vote and a debate on this issue. And that is to the great credit of the government. And they are bringing forward a motion that they may well lose tonight. And that's to their credit, to let this Parliament decide on this very important issue. And I do think this debate isn't particularly about the merits of overseas aid on point 7. It's about the state the economy is in. Now, I can't tell from sitting here, Madam Deputy Speaker, whether the Chancellor is his happy self, but he's very popular at the moment because he's been giving money away and helping people. But there is an economic crisis coming down the line. And certainly on these benches, we should recognise that, which is the reason we should support the cut of £4 billion in overseas aid. Because if we don't do that, the Chancellor either has to borrow £4 billion more, or he has to tax more, or he has to cut public expenditure. So that's actually what the issue is about, and that's why I will be supporting the government tonight. But can I just touch on what I think is more important with overseas aid is outcome, not the amount of money we're spending. And this was something that the Labour government used to say, we're spending record amounts of money. It didn't mean they were having record outcomes. And when I was chairman of the all-party group against human trafficking, it was often the small charities without state money that were doing the best outcomes. And the great thing about this government, Madam Deputy Speaker, is what they've done with the vaccine and AstraZeneca. The fact that we've given this to the world, and there'll be 3 billion doses across the world by the end of next year, is a tremendous testament to what this government has done. It's world-leading and it's changing the world, and it's saving millions of people from being seriously ill and dying. That's the sort of thing we should be proud about. We shouldn't be worried about a figure.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And many honourable and right honourable members have already spoken about the different areas that will be impacted by our proposed cut to international aid budget. And I want to focus my remarks on a subject which is really important. Last month marked 40 years since the first reported AIDS case and the subsequent discovery of HIV. And although we've made big progress in fighting HIV in the UK and across the world, AIDS remains a leading cause of death for women of reproductive age. And although preventable, over 1.5 million people acquired HIV last year, and 690,000 people lost their lives to an AIDS-related illness. The HIV epidemic continues to devastate communities right across the world. And yet screening has fallen by 40% in Africa and Asia over the past year. Ending new HIV transmissions in the UK is a global effort. And yet, shamefully, our funding to the UN AIDS project has been dropped by a staggering 83%. And as we only know too well, pandemics can only be beaten together. Up to now, the UK has been instrumental in reducing the stigma of this really terrible disease and helping to save the lives of millions of people. And I want to pay tribute to the Terence Higgins Trust for their new campaign launched today called Life Really Changed, celebrating people who live with HIV. I represent Vauxhall, a constituency with a large migrant population and one of the highest rates of HIV prevalence in the country. Now more than ever, it is so important, if we are truly committed to global Britain, to step up in our responsibilities, not step back. The UK should be taking a leading global step to help reverse the devastating spread of HIV and AIDS. Otherwise, how are we supposed to meet our target of 0 transmissions by 2030? I hope members will reflect on that. And it's not just about the issues that happen in our country here, but right across the world. And I hope that they will be joining me in voting against this motion. Thank you, Madam Deputy.
Tim Loden.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I welcome the fact the Government have brought this motion here today, but I'm afraid I'm going to vote against it and to restore the 0.7% commitment. I am worried that the new criteria would only have been met in one of the last 7 years, and goodness knows when it will be met again, and effectively we're locking in 0.5% for the foreseeable future. I acknowledge absolutely the huge generosity of the UK taxpayer and the contribution by COVAX and others. But we cannot stop now. I voted for, I campaigned for, I was really proud that a Conservative-led government brought in, enshrined in law, that 0.7% commitment. I stood on a manifesto to keep it in 2015, 2017 and 2019, proudly doing so. Our manifesto in 2019 said, we are proud of our peace-building and humanitarian efforts around the world, particularly in war-torn and divided societies, and of our record in helping to reduce global poverty. And we pledge to proudly maintain our commitment to spend 0.7% of GNI on development. No riders that it was dependent on the state of finances, whether debt's going up or down, or how much the Treasury is bringing in revenue. No small print, no ifs, no buts. And I believe in standing by manifesto pledges. And it would have been even more unsatisfactory if we'd not at least had this vote here today. Everyone's talked about difficult decisions. It was specifically to avoid short-term difficult decisions that we enshrined that commitment in law and crafted a careful formula so the money went up in good times and went down in bad times, as is happening. But this will be a double whammy, as everyone has said. It's going to go down because the economy has contracted, and it's going to go down further because the formula is being reduced as well. And of course, COVID has impacted severely on many countries whose health systems are far less resilient than ours in dealing with the pandemic. And as we know, global pandemics need globally coordinated action, as well as all facing the challenges of the new strains mutating in far-flung corners of the world. And the UK plays a key part in that and must continue playing a key part in that, not just with vaccines. But this is also a false economy. Abruptly pulling projects part-way through makes no financial sense and increases uncertainty. Pulling the malaria programme funding in Nigeria, which is supposed to go on to 2024, cutting 48 million from the NHS Overseas Training Scheme when people are being trained in important posts in developing countries, the 18 million cut to water sanitation in the middle of a pandemic, and the circumstances in Yemen that I mentioned earlier. Global Britain is about projecting not just military and diplomatic influence, not just about pursuing new trading and investment partnerships beyond this continent, but complementary to this is the exercise of soft power. Hugely important, and it's proved highly influential and effective for UK PLC, and our world-leading commitment to 0.7% enshrined in law is an important, and I have to say, very cost-effective part of that. Climate change is a major focus of it. We're chairing COP, for goodness sake. What message does that send to the rest of the world? This is a false economy at the wrong time.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, for calling me to speak in this very important debate, and I draw the attention of members to my register of interests. The choice we face here today is clear. Are we global Britain or little Britain? This is a trap for the unwary and, in fact, goes further than that. This is a deliberate cut of aid, which the party opposite has been wanting to do for a long time, and I share the concern of many parties, members opposite, in not wanting to be seen as the nasty party. We're the only G7 country to be cutting our aid, so it simply doesn't have to be done. We don't have to shrug our shoulders and say, we're in the middle of the pandemic, this is another cost of COVID, we just have to get on and do this. No, this is a deliberate choice about what we do to retain our promises to the world's poorest people at the time when we're all suffering around the world together. It's not only how much we're cutting as well, but how these cuts are being made. Not very strategically, very fast for many of the smallest projects which have the best outcomes, and without any impact assessment being done. 0.7 is not some arbitrary figure dreamt up by a Treasury civil servant. One of the most memorable days of my life was standing on a stage in Edinburgh introducing Eddie Izzard to a massive crowd of people. Why would I bring this up now? Because it was a Make Poverty History rally. People had come in coaches from across the whole country. They'd got up the night before and they travelled overnight. They'd come from communities all over the country. They were of all ages, all backgrounds, with one mission: that we wanted to make poverty history, and we wanted to see the 0.7% prescribed in law. And it was many years after that, so it's been many, many years of campaigning that brought the 0.7% into reality. And it's not something that we can lose so easily, because I share the concerns of many members that if we lose this today, it will be many, many years until we see the return, if ever, of that 0.7%, which the British public, Madam Deputy Speaker, do want to see. Exactly. People from across my constituency have written to me about the aid cuts, saying they do not agree with these cuts. It's a small amount in the whole scale of government spending, just 1% of our borrowing. And it's very good value for money. So it's false economy, and it's wrong to cut the South Sudanese peace project, which has been built up over many years, based in trust, and will result in a devastating results in South Sudan. It's been called a crushing blow to the people of South Sudan. So today is an opportunity to restore the cross-party agreement on aid, restore our ambition and our influential place in the world, to do the right thing and to vote against these cuts.
We now go to Catherine West. We don't seem to have any voice for Catherine West, so I'm going to go to Tobias Elwood and come back to Catherine West. Tobias Elwood.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. This is a vote about our soft power, a vote on the definition of global Britain, a test of our political courage to see the bigger international picture and stay committed to our international obligations even when we face difficulties at home. I will not tire of telling this House just how dangerous and complex our world is becoming. A simple question I put to the Prime Minister, the National Security Advisor, the Defence Secretary and all the respective heads of the armed forces: is global instability over the next 5 to 10 years going to increase or decrease? And in every single case, the answer was increase. We face a very unpredictable, uncertain decade, with growing authoritarianism, extremism on the rise, an ever-assertive China and Russia, and of course, climate change, increasingly wreaking havoc across the world. The government acknowledges this in its own integrated review, but hard and soft power are two sides of the same coin, as we learnt to our peril in Afghanistan. And to cut our soft power will have operational, strategic and reputational consequences. The sheer scale of global challenges was acknowledged at the G7 summit. Yet here we are, debating the reduction in our soft power profile, the only G7 nation to do so. In contrast, China is using its aid programs as a part of a long-term strategy to advance its own global reach. Look at what's happening across Africa and Asia. There is a new global soft power war taking place. This, to me, is the face of a Cold War that is slowly emerging, but we in the West have yet to wake up to its reality. China is weaponizing its immense soft power to significantly advance its influence and reach and to promote its own interpretation of the international rules-based order. And it ensnares dozens and dozens of countries into its sphere of influence. This is why we should not be diminishing our own soft power. I suspect the government may succeed today in winning the argument, but it will lose the moral high ground. We claim to be a problem-solving and burden-sharing nation with a global perspective. It is simply not a good look to promote a global Britain agenda emphasising leadership, responsibility and resolve, but then cut our overseas aid budget. I urge the government to ask what Churchill might say to the House now, given the 1930s feel to the world. Why not articulate to the nation the wider geopolitical uncertainty that we face, the urgency for the West to regroup, and the influential role that Britain could play if we retain our soft power commitments so we can begin to address the progressively dangerous trajectory our world is now on. I have no doubt if the government did this, the nation would be fully in support.
O'Hara.
Deputy Speaker, may I begin by saying how pleased I am that the government has finally bowed to pressure and we in this House are having the vote that we were promised in cutting money to the world's poorest people. And it's absolutely right that we have that vote, because every member of this House must declare his or her position. I fear that without a meaningful vote, the members opposite could continue to hide behind crocodile tears or meaningless words of regret without ever having to display the courage of their conviction. and stand up and tell this government that the decision to take £5 billion away from the world's poorest people is fundamentally wrong and morally repugnant. So at the end of this debate, we will all have to declare where we stand, and no one can continue in the hope that by choosing to stay silent, that he or she will not be asked to come off the fence. And although this vote has been a long time coming, it does mean that we are all in this House well rehearsed of the arguments. And absolutely no one can pretend that he or she does not know what they are voting for this evening, or they do not understand the consequences of their actions when they vote. And they now know that if they do support this motion, that money is not coming back. Madam Deputy Speaker, I find it utterly incomprehensible that the government of one of the richest countries in the world appears hell-bent on making the poorest people on this planet even poorer and more susceptible and vulnerable to disease, hunger and a lack of clean water. And for them to push this as vigorously as they have done, despite every single analysis telling them and us that millions of people will die, simply beggars belief. And it is shameful that if this motion is agreed tonight, it will mark a new low point for a country that pretends or boasts about being a beacon for tolerance, decency and humanity. This is the test of that vote. As I've said before, this country has a moral obligation to help those now what we call the developing world, not least because this country is in no small way responsible for the situation that they now find themselves in. The UK, Great Britain, grew rich, powerful on the backs of the world's poor. We invaded, conquered, divided and plundered, leaving behind an impoverished wasteland. And it's about time this country woke up to its moral responsibility to assist those we abandoned to live with the consequences of British imperialism, and we should not be running away from that responsibility. And those on the benches opposite have to accept that as a consequence of their action tonight.
We now go back to Catherine West.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And could I say what a pleasure it is to follow the member for Argyll and Bute, who's wearing a navy suit and a navy tie with white dots on it, just like our favourite football manager, Mr. Southgate. I'm very proud to stand on my promise today, laid out in the manifesto of each of the political parties in the House, for the UK government to spend 0.7% of gross national income on the world's poorest. The UK's economy and health have been ravaged by COVID. And in my local authority area alone, COVID has led to many, many deaths and the loss of jobs. Haringey Borough has one of the highest numbers of workers on furlough and at risk of joblessness in the autumn. And child poverty is on the increase. However, my constituents care deeply about the work the UK does across the globe, especially in Africa. They do not wish to see so many girls lacking in education. They do not wish to see more infants die from malaria. And they do not wish to see Daesh prosper from the withdrawal of important civil society programs promoting stability across North Africa. This decision today will affect the UK's regional universities as well. For example, it could inhibit the important work that is done to strengthen health systems across the globe by working with doctors and nurses through the Liverpool School of Tropical Medicine, or the important scientific work carried out to make insecticide-treated anti-malarial bed nets through Durham University research capacity. The Prime Minister claims to support British science, but this motion suggests the opposite. We know that in 2021, there were 23 more billionaires who reached the Times Rich list. Inequality is worsening day by day, and this proposal fails to address the grotesque inequality across the globe. If I thought by agreeing with the government today it would instead fund summer schools for children in my constituency, or would mean reinstating the 5,000 mental health beds withdrawn since 2010, or it would fund the capital needed on social homes to fund home housing services for those in housing need, I would change my mind. Instead, this motion is the beginning of more austerity, the £20 cut to universal credit recipients, the potential breaking of the triple lock for pensioners, and further cuts to local government. The last 10 years has brought the country to its knees and weakened health systems and society. So when COVID reached our shores, we fell like flies. When will we learn that the government must act to protect and build defences, or else we will suffer even more?
Magnell.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And can I start by thanking the government, because they have been courteous in having the Prime Minister and indeed the Chancellor both present and respond to this debate. They have been courteous in holding a vote at long last. But I'm afraid that is where my thanks end. As we have heard in the course of this debate, this was not only a manifesto commitment by every political party in this place, it was also a commitment to the world's poorest. It was a commitment to join in force with other nations around the world. And many members in this House have said that we didn't do anything, no other country followed us. But Germany, Denmark, Sweden, Norway, Luxembourg all now fulfil the 0.7% target. France next year is set to hit the 0.7% target. The United States of America has uplifted its spending by $16 billion. And we say that we didn't have influence, Madam Deputy Speaker. Well, I beg to differ. What we are debating today is really about the fight for parliamentary engagement. What this House voted on in 2015 in the Development Act, which enshrined the right to make sure that we weren't making short-term decisions, to make sure that when the good years were good, the spending went up, and when the bad years were bad, the spending went down, something that we should have kept in mind before we made today's decision. Instead, Madam Deputy Speaker, what we have been offered is a mirage. What looks like a compromise is something that will never be reached. It is an issue that, despite the arbiters of the OBR, the spending decisions will still be made by the Treasury, and this announcement comes before a spending review. So we don't know how much is going to be spent on social care, on health, on education. We don't know what the financial commitments will be of the government in the years to come, and therefore we are being led down the garden path. And for that, Madam Deputy Speaker, I am appalled. Like Gordon Brown's checklist to join the euro, we will never meet these targets. Madam Deputy Speaker, this is a short-termist approach. I have seen the value, as has many of members in this House, of what we spend in foreign aid, whether it is women's education, whether it is on AIDS programmes, whether it is de-radicalisation, whether it is on climate change. I believe passionately that the UK leads by example in these areas. And for that, I will not apologise for voting against the government tonight. I will not apologise for the fact that I will be standing up on behalf of the NGOs and the experts who are based in the UK, who operate around the world, who lead by example and help other organisations follow suit. For that, Madam Deputy Speaker, I offer no apology. But I remind members of this House that we make an extraordinary impact in the world. And to shirk it for a short-term decision is something that we should all be appalled by.
Jardine.
Thank you very much. I'd like to thank the honourable member for this excellent speech. Madam Deputy Speaker, 22 years ago I visited a hospital in sub-Saharan Africa where a woman who was about the same age as I was then was being treated for AIDS. When I say treated, I'm stretching the definition to breaking point. She was receiving aspirin and I felt totally helpless. That visit was part of a professional trip to write about the work being done by an international Christian charity. But it was part of a much more important journey for me. My once carefully protected eyes had long before been open to the poverty in the world. But on that trip and others, I came to realise the significance of the international aid the UK government provides, both in creating a stable international community and making a real difference to the lives of the people who need it most. The Prime Minister earlier highlighted the work that this government is doing as part of the global response to the pandemic, and yes, we are. But these cuts are being made at a time when ministers have often cited that no country is safe until the virus is under control in every country. The same applies to international aid. The world is in the grip of insecurity and democracies are under threat. Long-term strategic support is key to building resilience and capacity in places like Myanmar. By reducing our support, power vacuums will be filled by countries like Russia and China with very different agendas to ours. China has their 500 Confucius Institutes across 140 countries with plans for 1,000 more, and they are increasing their global presence through education and culture as part of a strategy of having boots on the ground, their boots on the ground, education and soft power. And where are we? Withdrawing from the international stage, cutting the international aid budget, leaves the British Council some £10 million short. It's led to 20 offices being closed. Global Britain? How? If we blunt the very tool which delivers and embodies that ideal. So instead of saying, look, what we're doing isn't that great, what we see in the world around us should be driving us on to do more, underline how important it is, make us determined to fight to save children from starving and girls being abused, to help protect and enhance their health, their rights and their democracies, because we do have the ability. And the government reassures us this is a temporary measure. But the definition of that measure is, frankly, the height of cynicism and heartlessness. I certainly will.
I thank her for giving way, and she will have spent time knocking on doors in Cheshire and Amersham as I did. Is that characterisation of the new Tory party exactly what many of those voters were saying was why they were turning away from the Tories in that election and voted Lib Dem instead?
I thank the honourable member for a comment, and yes, it was, as we have heard from other honourable members today. And those same people will know that more than 2 billion people in this world do not have access to clean water, and that cutting aid will make it more difficult to change that. The rate of HIV infection across the world remains at 1.7 million people in 2019 alone. The leading killer of women of reproductive age is AIDS. When I visited that hospital 22 years ago, I felt helpless. I feel the same today. But my government can help. This government can help. And tonight, I will be voting to remind them that they should.
Mark Harper.
I'm grateful, Madam Deputy Speaker. I listened very carefully to many of the speeches that have been made today, and many of them focus on the promise that was in our manifesto about aid spending. That's entirely correct, Madam Deputy Speaker. But as I said in one of my interventions, we also made commitments to not borrow money for day-to-day spending. We also made commitments to reduce our debt burden. All of those commitments have been made more challenging by the global pandemic that we have faced. And what the Treasury has put forward today, which I will be supporting, and I hope all of my colleagues will, is an attempt to deal with the challenge from the pandemic and deliver on all of our manifesto commitments in the way that we're now going to have to reflect the reality of what's happened over the last year. Now, I've also heard many members talk about the borrowing that we've had to make over the last year. And I know the Chancellor, and I am very proud of that borrowing because it's helped us get through what has been an incredibly difficult year. But one-off borrowing for a crisis isn't the same as ongoing day-to-day spending. And I have to say I'm surprised by many of my colleagues who talk about the £5 billion a year that it would cost to replace this spending as if £5 billion wasn't a lot of money. I can remember, Madam Deputy Speaker, many difficult conversations when I was a minister and indeed when I was Government Chief Whip about far smaller sums of money, sometimes involving many of the colleagues that I've heard talk about £5 billion as if it were nothing. And I'm afraid we are going to have to get used to the fact that there are certain realities in the world that money that we spend has to be paid for. It's either got to be borrowed or financed from taxation. And one of the problems we've now got with the borrowing we've had to make over the last year is we're now very vulnerable to increases in inflation or interest rates. I heard someone say we're living in an era of low interest rates. Well, we don't know how long that's going to last. And a 1% rise in inflation and interest rates would cost us £25,000 million, which would be 5 times the level of amount of money we're arguing about today. And those are the realities that not just the Chancellor has to grapple with, but all of us in this Parliament, and particularly those of us in the governing party. My final point, Madam Deputy Speaker, is just to say to my colleagues, this debate, I fear, is going to be repeated many times as we move through the comprehensive spending route. We're all going to have to face very difficult challenges. Governing is about choosing. It's about setting priorities about what we think is important. This is important, but so is keeping the fiscal measures on balance, and all of them are important, and I'm glad the Chancellor's brought forward the measures he has today.
I'm sorry we haven't been able to get more speakers in, but we now have to move to the roundups. Shadow Chancellor of the Exchequer, Rachel Reeves.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. This government says global Britain is at the heart of how we engage with the world. But this move to unilaterally cut overseas aid is a direct attack on what it means to be global Britain. It is a decision that will reduce our power, it will reduce our influence in the world, and it will undermine our security here at home. At this moment, perhaps more than at any other, we should be looking to project our power and influence for good around the world, to create change in our national interest, but in the global interest too. I am proud, we should all be proud, in this House and across our great nations, of what we've achieved together through overseas aid. Because together we have pushed polio to the verge of eradication. Together we have improved water and sanitation for more than 1.5 million people. Together we have reduced maternal and infant mortality, as my right honourable friend, the member for East Ham, spoke of. And together we have ensured that girls in the poorest places in the world can go to school, as we all take for granted that our daughters and granddaughters can go to school. Yet today the government seeks to undo that great progress. Instead of being a global leader, this government seeks to retreat on the international stage. And I can see the understandable discomfort that this is causing for honourable and right honourable members on the benches opposite, who know that the consequences of this decision and the short-sightedness of what the Prime Minister has said and what the Chancellor, I fear, will go on to say today will mean. In particular, I want to commend the contributions today of the Right Honourable Member for Sutton Coldfield, who advised colleagues to beware the traps set for the unwary. My right honourable friend, the member for Leeds Central, who said that this motion today is just not who we are as a people. And the right honourable member for Houghton, Price and Howden, who says, when it is a choice between lives and money, I choose lives. And the reason that there has been a consensus from 5 previous Prime Ministers, including the Right Honourable Lady, the member for Maidenhead, across both parties, on the importance of the 0.7% commitment, is because the case for overseas aid expresses both our moral responsibilities that we have and because it is firmly in the national interest too. I'll give way briefly.
I thank the Shadow Minister for giving way. One of the NGOs and trusts that I would be involved with is the Halo Trust. They're the organisation who clear mines, unexploded ordnance and IEDs. If it comes to giving money to one group, there's a group that saves lives, as the Honourable Lady refers to.
Yeah. I thank the honourable gentleman for that intervention, and he speaks powerfully of what he has seen. What has guided former Prime Ministers and Ministers is a moral compass. And I ask honestly to the Chancellor, what moral compass guides the Prime Minister and government ministers today as we cut those lifelines of support, and in the midst of a global pandemic as well? Now, for several decades, we have recognised that the world is increasingly interdependent, that overseas aid helps tackle poverty and infectious diseases, it helps tackle climate change, reduces conflict and terrorism, and the need for people to flee their own countries and seek refuge elsewhere. A point that the Chancellor himself made in 2015, arguing that the government's commitment to international aid is a tangible example of leadership. Well, Mr. Speaker, where is that leadership today? Because crucially, overseas aid helps us respond to pandemics. COVID cannot be eliminated anywhere if it is not eliminated everywhere. And these cuts will impede the ability for some of the poorest countries in the world to mobilise their public health systems and roll out this vaccine effectively. What good does that do any of us here? Until COVID is under control globally, the risk is that this virus mutates and it comes back to Britain and threatens all of us, including those who have already been double vaccinated. Now, the Chancellor knows full well that our country's commitments are as a proportion of our gross national income, and that is right. And it means that as our economy grows, our generosity as a country grows. But as our economy shrinks, so does our generosity to those in the poorest parts of the world. That is right, and it happens automatically without the cuts that are being proposed on top of that. As the Right Honourable Gentleman for East Worthing and Shoreham puts it, the simplicity of the 0.7% commitment is built into the formula. Our payments go up in times of plenty and they fall back when the economy is more stretched. But with a 30% reduction, that's what we're talking of today, a 30% reduction in just 1 year, never has our aid budget been cut so savagely, so suddenly, and by so much. And let us be very clear about the tests for returning to 0.7% of GNI spent on overseas aid. The second test that the Chancellor has set out is around our debt to GDP ratio falling. Now, the OBR forecasts that this won't be met next year or the year after. At the very earliest, it will be met in the financial year 24-25. But let's look at the first test. In the last 30 years, the current budget balance test being proposed by the Chancellor today has only been met 5 times, and only for 1 year under a Conservative government. But the test proposed by the Chancellor, it goes further than that, because it doesn't just say a current budget balance, it says a sustainable current budget balance. And that is something that has only been met in the last 30 years under a Labour government. So if the Chancellor's small print conditions are applied to the latest OBR forecasts, then we will not be achieving a current budget surplus in the whole of the forecast period. These aren't tests to go back to 0.7% of GNI spent on overseas aid, but to stop that ever happening under a Conservative government again. So let us be clear about what we are voting for this evening. If we vote for the Chancellor's proposal today, this won't just be for a year. It will hang over us for as long as the Conservatives are in government. Mr. Speaker, if the Chancellor is serious about saving money, and I believe in value for money in every pound of taxpayers' money spent, then why, Mr. Speaker, did the Chancellor happily sign off cheques? £2.6 million on a media briefing room that won't be properly used. £200 million on a vanity yacht project to sell global Britain around the world. Well, why not invest that money on overseas aid instead? £37 billion on a test and trace system that doesn't even work. And £2 billion on crony contracts for friends and donors of the Conservative Party. What exactly does it say about the priorities of this government? And why is the overseas aid budget being singled out for cuts by this government? Because it is ideological, it is not about value for money. If this is what goes through this evening, and this is what the House votes for, it will diminish Britain. It will reduce our power and influence for good in the world. And it will undermine our security here at home too. This isn't just about how much aid we give overseas. It's about the country that we are and the country that we want to be. Whether you're a government or a football team, when you're on the world stage, how you conduct yourself and whether you lead by example really matters. Many honourable and right honourable members on this side and opposite too know in their hearts, but in their heads too, that what the government is proposing is profoundly wrong. And they also know full well that it breaks the proud promises that we all made at the last election just 18 months ago, not just for the crisis, but for as long as the Conservatives are in government. So I urge honourable and right honourable members to reject this motion today and do what they know is right for the poorest people in the world and to honour those proud commitments that we all made in the national interest.
Chancellor of the Exchequer, Rishi Sunak.
Mr. Speaker, I'm grateful to members on all sides for their passionate and principled contributions to today's debate. And given the short time available, let me just highlight some of the powerful speeches we've heard in support of the government's motion today. including from the honourable members for Somerton and Frome, Hitchin and Harpenden, Rutland, Derbyshire Dales, Rushcliffe and Wellingborough. Now, of course, Mr. Speaker, I am disappointed that not all of my colleagues feel able to support the government today, including the Right Honourable Member for Maidenhead. And of course, nobody can doubt the sincere commitment to this cause by the Right Honourable Member for Sutton Coldfield. And I'm grateful to the Honourable Member for Tonbridge and Malling for his kind words about my career before being in this place. There were particularly thoughtful speeches, Mr. Speaker, from the members, or the Right Honourable Members for Tunbridge Wells and Kenilworth and Southam, both of whom highlighted the explicit provisions in the 2015 Act that envisaged these circumstances happening. I can give the Right Honourable Member for Tunbridge Wells my commitment to the £22 billion, which I believe very strongly in, as does the Prime Minister. We are determined to create a science superpower in this country. As ever, my Right Honourable friend, the member for Forest of Dean, made a powerful speech about our promises, Mr. Speaker, all our promises, not just some. And whilst the party opposite may not be concerned with promises about managing the public finances and responsibly looking after people's money, people on this side of the House always will, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, before I begin, may I also pay tribute to those members who have worked with the government, and I'm grateful for their constructive cooperation over the past few weeks in finding what I believe is a genuine compromise to bring this House together so that we can support a policy which commands, I think, the broad acceptance not just of this place, but of the British people. Those Right Honourable Members and Honourable Members include the members for Stafford, Bromley and Chislehurst, Milton Keynes North, South Northamptonshire, and Bexhill and Battle. I am very grateful to them for all their engagement. Mr. Speaker, what we are asking the House to vote for today is a roadmap for returning to 0.7%. This roadmap reaffirms our values whilst recognising the reality that COVID has caused severe damage to our public finances. It puts beyond doubt that the reduction in the aid budget is temporary. It defines a reasonable set of tests for when we will return to 0.7, and it makes those tests objective and verifiable based on data, not dates, measured not by the government ourselves, but by the independent OBR. I'm happy to give way.
Grateful for the chance of giving way. Does he accept that in areas of instability and potential social decline, when you withdraw aid and you withdraw support, they are more likely to end up needing the support of our military? We know this for fact because we've had to do it a lot in the past. Does he not accept the principle that in areas that are extremely volatile, it is much, much cheaper to the British purse to support via aid workers than to send the military in with hardware and to put our soldiers in the front line, often in danger?
Yeah. Well, Mr. Speaker, it is not either or. This government is doing both. We are one of the largest donors to the UN peacekeeping operations, and is why we are making a difference in countries across the globe, not just through our ODA budget, but through all the other ways we express global leadership.
I'm extremely grateful to the Right Honourable for giving way. He's right. The countries with big hearts also need clear heads. So will he confirm that with the roadmap he set out today and the proposals before this House, we will still be spending 20% more than we were when the party opposite was last in government on overseas aid?
If my numbers are right, Mr. Speaker, as a percentage of GDP, we were for the last few years spending double what the party opposite ever spent when they were in office, and he is right about what we will be doing even at this reduced level. But, Mr. Speaker, let me make some progress. Today's approach is a pragmatic approach to meet our commitments to the world's poorest today and have the secure fiscal foundations we need to meet those commitments for decades to come. Mr. Speaker, we should be proud of what UK overseas aid means to millions of the world's poorest people. It means tens of millions of girls around the world getting a better education. It means food parcels stamped with a Union Jack arriving in famine-stricken countries like Syria and Somalia. It means wind turbines, solar panels and hydroelectric dams generating clean energy in developing countries. And I am proud, as I know the whole House will be proud, of the extraordinary good this country is doing around the world.
Grateful to the Chancellor, and would he remind the House, who rightly very keen that we save as many lives as possible, that this country has given a great gift to the world with many free vaccines and pioneering the cheapest and one of the best vaccines to save lives all around the world.
I completely agree with my right honourable friend, and I will come on to that in a minute. Mr. Speaker, I'm proud too of our response to last year's economic crisis, the deepest recession this country has ever seen. In total, we've provided hundreds of billions of pounds to protect jobs, keep businesses afloat and help families get by. That was the right approach, but we should be clear-eyed. COVID has severely damaged our public finances. The highest level of borrowing since World War II. National debt of £2 trillion and rising, debt expected to peak at 100% of GDP. And if we want to continue to meet our commitments in the future, both at home and overseas, we must act now to rebuild our fiscal resilience. And in spite of... I'll give way one last time.
Also, the Chancellor are giving way. All of this is all well and good, but they'd already taken the decision to scrap the Department for International Development before COVID came along. That's how committed they were to international aid.
On the contrary, Mr. Speaker, this government has brought a coherence, a strategic symmetry to our approach to international development and foreign policy, which is improving how we project our influence and effectiveness around the world. But I must make progress, Mr. Speaker. I've heard that this is the only difficult thing that we are apparently doing. That is simply not true. We have had to build fiscal resilience and have asked businesses to pay more tax. We have frozen the personal income tax allowance, taken a targeted approach to public sector pay, and yes, we also had to take the difficult decision to temporarily reduce our aid budget. And this decision follows a path Parliament explicitly envisaged when it enshrined the 0.7% target in law. Section 2, subsection 3 of the 2015 Act clearly foresaw the fiscal circumstances that might mean the target could not be met. And, Mr. Speaker, let us be honest. If that test is not being met in the aftermath of the worst economic shock in 300 years, surely it never will. This decision, Mr. Speaker, is categorically not a rejection of our global responsibilities. The UK will spend over £10 billion this year on overseas development. According to the latest figures, that's more as a proportion of our national income than all but 2 of the G7 countries, more than Japan, Canada, Italy and the United States, and much more than the average of the 29 countries in the OECD's Development Assistance Committee. But our spending on humanitarian causes goes far beyond just our ODA budget. We have the 4th biggest defence and security budget in the world, the 3rd largest diplomatic network. On average, we contribute nearly £500 million a year to the UN peacekeeping budget. We use our trade policy to reduce poverty, with developing countries benefiting from tariff savings of up to £1 billion a year. It's why we're working with the G7 to deliver the Clean and Green Infrastructure Financing Initiative, and with UK government support, this year 1.5 billion people around the world will be vaccinated with the Oxford AstraZeneca jab, provided at no profit whatsoever. So, Mr. Speaker, there is no question of our commitment to overseas aid. The only question is when we return to the 0.7% target. The motion before the House puts beyond all doubt that we will do so once 2 clear objective tests have been met. Our national debt is falling and we are no longer borrowing for day-to-day spending. These tests are in line with the approach set out in our manifesto and at budget. They are practical and realistic. Mr. Speaker, if the House votes against the motion today, this is an effective vote. We will return, irrespective of the circumstances, to 0.7 next year. Instead of voting for responsibility, the House would, in effect, be voting to say no circumstances could ever justify a move. In conclusion, Mr. Speaker, I know a deep sense of conscience underpins the view that the amount we spend on overseas aid is a moral issue. Many in this House will know the words, charity is patient, is kind. I think of those words and I share that sense of conscience. That is why we are maintaining the target, not abolishing it. That's why we are setting out the conditions, not obscuring. We are basing the conditions independently.
Order, order. The question is, as on the order paper, as many that opinion say aye. Aye. Of the contrary, no. No! Aye. Division, clear the lobbies. Are you both ready? Quick one. Okay. The question is, as on the order paper, as many of that opinion... Order. Let's sit down, please. The question is, as on the order paper, as many of that opinion say aye. Aye. The contrary, no. No. The tellers for the ayes are David Rutley and Maria Coalfield. For the noes, I've got it the wrong way round. For the tellers for the ayes are Jessica Morden, Anthony Magdal. For the noes are David Rutley. No, the ayes. I was right first time. I was right first time. Somebody said I wasn't. I was. Right. For the ayes are David Rutley and Maria Coalfield. For the noes, Jessica Morden and Anthony Magdal. Thank you.